Hi, and welcome to this recording of the launch event for the report Petrochemicals and Climate Change, Powerful Fossil Fuel Lock-ins and Interventions for Transformative Change. Due to some technical difficulties, the first minutes of the live event were unfortunately not recorded, which is why I am welcoming you from my office. My name is Frederick Bauer, and I will be moderating the event. I am an Associate Senior Lecturer in Technology and Society at Lund University, and I was the PI for the 3-year research project that is summarized in this report. The project gathered an international team of scholars and experts to dive deep into the structure, operations, and governance of the global petrochemicals industry. You will very soon meet some of the team members as they present the key findings from our work. Then we have invited Professor Jonathan Cullen to present his research on the opportunities that exist to transform the petrochemical industry in line with international climate targets. Thereafter, we have 2 panel sessions, during which we will first discuss what the connection between fossil fuels and petrochemicals means for the possibilities for transformation, and then what the needs and opportunities for reform of international governance are, especially now in connection with the Global Plastics Treaty that is being negotiated. Again, you are most welcome, and let's move on to the main session.
We are moving into the section where we'll present the key insights from this project and from the report. The report is now available for free download from the Lund University research portal. And in this report, we go through a number of aspects that we find relevant for understanding the barriers to change in this industry in terms of the actors, ownership structures, infrastructure expansion, and different regional development trends. We look into the webs of finance that support and perpetuate expansion of this industry around the world. We dive into the contested futures of petrochemicals and also look at global governance regime of petrochemicals and how its fragmented nature is a barrier in itself to effective governance. And these are aspects that we will be presenting in this session. And so let me welcome up the some of the contributors to this report. First, let me welcome Joachim Peter Tilstedt, who is a doctoral student here at Lund University, who will start talking about the industry structure.
Thanks. Yeah, I have the pleasure of starting with going through some of the main findings around the industry structure. And let me just start by saying that, I mean, this is a whole report. This will be about key insights and some of the highlights that I want to raise here. And so there is much more detail and much more, say, perhaps also more nuance to be found in the report. But for now, I want to focus on the industry structure as it stands. And our attention is to fossil fuel lock-ins in the petrochemical industry. And so we're interested in the integration across the value chain, and especially links upstream to fossil fuel extraction and fossil fuel interests. And if you take that lens, then you can see that many of the biggest petrochemical producers, they also own large shares, large assets or large fossil fuel assets. And so what you have here is a basic classification. You could say a typology of petrochemical producers with varying share of fossil fuels in their portfolio and their total assets, and also varying state influence. And we see, there's national oil companies very active in this sector, as well as large international oil and gas companies, and then more chemicals focused or petrochemicals oriented companies with which do not have their main activities, the main business core activities structured around fossil fuel extraction. And also here we see varying state influence, state ownership, and thereby also varying domestic political interests being pushed through these companies. And what I also included here is a table that table is say, I mean, I can say this, but what does it mean in practice? This table is a high-level summary of the assets of the 52 biggest producers, biggest petrochemical producers. We've been looking at all their assets, and then we classified them according to industry codes to see, okay, to what extent are the biggest producers also active across the value chain. And what we find here is that the share or the value of fossil fuel assets, fossil fuel extraction and refining, that's amongst the biggest chemical producers is actually larger than the share of chemical assets, and that the turnover amongst the biggest petrochemical producers are actually mainly focused on fossil fuel extraction. But of course, this is an aggregate picture, and as you see, you have international and national oil and gas companies active in the sector. So maybe it's just a few firms that are driving these aggregate numbers. So we also wanted to ask, to what extent can we actually talk about a globally aligned industry? Can we talk about global industry interests, or to what extent do we see economic legal ties between fossil fuel extraction and petrochemical production? And to look further into this, we conducted a network analysis. So we did a network analysis of the biggest producers in the world, specifically the 52 biggest producers, and we looked at all their listed subsidiaries, all the entities which they hold ownership in, and then we cross-referenced these different lists, and then together we use this to create or to map this ownership network. And it covers both some joint ventures, but also there's some think tanks in there, industry organizations, all entities in which the biggest producers, they share ownership. And I mean, in terms of the details, there is a paper on this where we focus on this specifically. There's also more in the report, but I think what is important to take from this, or the main finding to take for this, is that we can see considerable integration of fossil fuel and chemical interests on a global scale, extensive legal economic ties, and that some of the most central actors are also some of the actors with, say, the clearest interest in a fossil-based future for chemicals. And the argument goes, right, that if the industry is dispersed and disintegrated, well, then you can also say it holds fewer interests in common on a global scale. And then conversely, if actors globally are highly interlocked with strong ties to fossil interest, well, then we would expect a higher degree of collective and coordinated efforts around steering a transition in a fossil-friendly direction. Okay, then how do we see this play out? Because this is just mapping trends, or mapping ties, but do we actually also see industry actors promote more fossil-friendly futures, or what stories do they mobilize to explain what they're doing and their actions and their investment patterns? And to do this, we looked into narratives, the stories that these actors mobilize, and we were inspired by research on climate delay discourse by industries that are, say, or actors in general, can also be states, which accept the existence of climate change, but use certain discourse to justify inaction or inadequate efforts relative to the science. And there's a paper on this, also flagging here, of course, that goes much more in depth, but just wanna take you through the main findings here. So what we find is three dominating narratives: that the sector is already well underway, that it is helping realize sustainability efforts, and that it's key to realizing sustainability right now, and that the industry actors are technology pioneers that have throughout history, and supposedly can do so again, been promoting and innovating to an extent where breakthrough technologies is a core part of the industry DNA. And what is interesting about is that these say some of these narratives are not they rely on some legitimate concerns, or it's not just climate delay or climate denial. It's more climate delay in that it's very selective, and it's also relying on carbon accounting that is inconsistent. It relies on selective statistics. It relies on certain degree of cherry picking, promoting projects without seeing it relative to total fossil-based investments or capital expenditures in fossil-based expansions. And together we can see how these narratives they justify both the current sustainability efforts as well as the current production and also the current investments, and promote an overall narrative that the industry is in control, that this, and however difficult this might be, a transition for petrochemicals should be are safest in the hands of industry actors, and can indeed only be carried out if we listen to the actors that are closely related to the industry and that know how well they are actually doing. And with that, I turn to the next part of the key insights from the report on financial key financial aspects and the webs of finance that underlie the expansion of the petrochemical industry.
Thank you, and thank you for this kind of nice introduction, because a lot of what I mention now is a lot of important. Yes, sorry, I should introduce myself. My name is Jakob Skovgaard. I'm work at the Department of Political Science here at Lund University. I very much enjoyed being part of this project, learned a lot about plastics and petrochemicals. Like Lars, I'm much newer to petrochemicals and plastics than Lars, but also it was a steep learning curve for me, and there's still a lot to learn about plastics and petrochemicals. But I have learned something, and something I've been involved in regarding to this project is the role of finance. Because as Joachim pointed out, there is an ongoing expansion and rapid expansion of petrochemical and investment in petrochemicals that will lock in future production of petrochemicals for decades to come. Once the petrochemical facility is built and there's been poured billions of dollars into it, it will probably remain operative, or it's very difficult to take it off the grid, because it will mean that all the costs have been sunk into this petrochemical plant will be lost if they're taken out of production before it ends of its lifetime. So there's a lot of money flowing into petrochemical plants and investment. The International Energy Agency a couple of years ago said that investments in petrochemical facilities need to scale down immediately and cease by 2030. That is, those that are dependent on fossil fuels, not necessarily newer non-fossil fuel based kinds of petrochemicals, but any kind of fossil fuel petrochemical investment will need to scale down immediately and cease by 2030. Because otherwise it will simply risk locking in high emission levels. So what we did in this part of the project is we looked into finance of larger petrochemical projects. Particularly, we looked at those projects or petrochemical plants that have a capital expenditure of above $1 billion. And that's partly because it's a nice round number, but also because it's one problem that we occurred that it's very hard to find good data on these kind of investments. But if we picked a high enough threshold of $1 billion, we could be certain that the data would be reliable. But the data I'm going to going to present in a minute or two is not the entire picture. It's just these 57 projects that have a capital expenditure of above $1 billion. One thing we're very keen on to look at is the role of public finance, because states have committed via the Paris Agreement to end all financial streams that are not aligned with the Paris Agreement objectives. So these kind of flows into major petrochemical plants are not aligned with the Paris Agreement's Article 2.1. But public finance is also interesting because it plays a big role in leveraging or crowding in private finance. We know this from other parts of literature on public finance when it comes to development finance, when it comes to fossil fuel finance. It plays a big role, because often it takes on a larger part of the risk. If you look at not just state finance, but also growth of multilateral development banks, bilateral development banks, export-import credit agencies. The key role is that they have to take a larger share of the risk than the private financiers, and this way crowd in private finance. It also sends a very strong signal to the private financiers, saying that there is a public commitment to this. If a state invests or lends money to a private project, it's an indication that the state is committed to this. It means that the private investor can feel relatively certain that the state's not going to backtrack on this. And the same goes with multilateral development bank finance, sends a signal there is a powerful backer of the project. This thing is very much underexplored when it comes to petrochemicals, and that's why we wanted to look into this and see what kind of role they played in these large petrochemical plants. And this is summarizing our study of the 57 largest petrochemical plants, those with a capital expenditure of above $1 billion. If you look at it, I hope it's legible in the room as well as online. Bulk of it is private, about $204 billion. And this is, I should say, over the period of 2010 to 2020. But public finance still amounted for $33 billion. Most of it went to greenfield investments. About $213 billion. About 24 went to brownfield investment. That is probably to a large degree due to the fact we had such a high threshold, because a lot of the brownfield investments are below the $1 billion threshold. Interesting in terms of expansion, most of the money went to Asia Pacific and Middle East Middle East and North Africa, two regions where petrochemical production is expanding and some degree relocating from some of the old centers in Europe. A lot of the money, what you cannot see on this Sankey diagram, came from North America and Europe, but went to projects in the Asia Pacific and the Middle East, North Africa. And most of it went to either was classified as plastics or plastics mixed. So other fertilizer being a much smaller part of what's produced from these plants. So the public involvement, to say a bit about this, public finance only amounted to about 14% of the overall finance, but it was present in more than 45% of the projects, and more present in parts of the world such as Middle East and North Africa, where the state is typically tied very much to fossil fuel production. And this, I should also mention, this does not exclude the role of export credits or state ownership. So if you look at, because we have 4 different case studies in the paper on financing of different plants, but if you just, I'm not going to bore you with all 4 of them, but if you look at one of them, a very prominent one, the Sadara plant in Saudi Arabia, state involvement played a big role. Sadara, if it's not already the largest petrochemical plant within one phase, it will soon become that. It's owned 65% by Saudi Aramco, which is mainly owned by the Saudi state and very close ties to the Saudi state, and 35% by Dow Chemicals that Joachim also highlighted before. Interestingly, beyond the ownership, it also received over $5.6 billion in public finance, including a $5 billion loan from the US Export-Import Bank, the largest loan in the history of the US Export-Import Bank, even with the attention of like securing, enhancing the American industry that works on petrochemicals and are involved in the production of such a plant. So in this way, also enhancing lock-in within the US and the US government, and as well as governments from other countries, also countries with a say more consistently green profile than the US, such as France or the UK, very much involved in this project and other projects that we go through in more detail in our chapter on finance in this report. Projects in Mozambique, Uzbekistan, and the US. So all of this, if I have to wrap up, underscores the not only the size and the importance of finance in making this expansion possible of petrochemical production, but also that private and public actors are very much entangled, and private and public finance is very much entangled, and also comes from public actors such as US government under Obama, because this loan was approved not during the Trump administration, but during the Obama administration. Other governments that are traditionally seen as green, as well as multilateral development banks, such as the Asia Development Bank, which is also has a very explicit commitment to fighting climate change. And this should lead into the next speaker. With Johan, we'll talk more about the wider context.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So my name is Johan Olsen. I'm a researcher at the Swedish Environmental Research Institute. Happy to be here today. I joined the project pretty late, so we should mention Tobias Nielsen as well, who used to be a colleague at the Swedish Environmental Research Institute. I tried to take his place in the project. And I've also learned a lot. Really strong team. I'll talk a little bit more. So, like we've heard, the project has a global focus, but the investment decisions is taken on a national level often. Like we heard before, there's a lot of global ties, but in our part of the project, we wanted to dive into the national context in which these petrochemical firms operate, and say something about what that means for the chances of the industry changing, or how the context contributes to the current fossil lock-ins. We looked into 3 categories of indicators: the natural resources, the role of the industry in the national economy, and also the general socio-political landscape. And we focused on 10 countries, which account for more than 75% of the petrochemical producing capacity globally. So China and US in the top, but also South Korea, Japan, Iran, and so on. And we looked into, like I said, 3 categories of indicators. The first one is obvious, perhaps, but access to natural resources, how much fossil fuels and fossil raw materials these countries access to. But also, if we want to look at the chances of escaping the fossil lock-in, what are the situation when it comes to renewable energy? We also looked into the petrochemicals role in the economy. So what's the general economic status of these countries, what share of the economy does the petrochemical industry account for, and what's the country's role in petrochemical and plastics trade, and what role does the petrochemical industry play in the labor market, and a couple of social political indicators as well. What is the status of the national climate policy, situation when it comes to civil liberties, social protection, and labor rights. And this last number 8 here, we believe says something about the chances of building some kind of bottom-up pressure for change in the industry. So yeah, we cover a lot of ground. And some of the outcomes are perhaps obvious, some are not, we think, but we think it's an important perspective. Yeah, so very brief summary of the outcomes of this part of the work. Like the previous speakers have said, there are more details in the report, and there's hopefully a paper forthcoming in the review now, if you want to dig into the details. But again, maybe stating the obvious, but the challenge of turning around this tanker that is the petrochemical industry will look very different in oil and gas dependent countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Iran. Russia and Iran are large question marks for obvious reasons currently. In China, which is a main actor both when it comes to petrochemical production, but also plastics production and plastic sales, which a country which bases a lot of its petrochemical production on coal. In India, where there's a large potential or risk for continued growth in demand for both chemical products and plastic products, and countries like Germany and Japan, which have limited access to fossil fuels domestically, reasonably ambitious climate policy, which has show respect to civil liberties and recently developed socialist safety nets. And this links back to this question of the role in the economy and the role of the labor market, because we don't see much of a transition yet, but when it hopefully starts to unroll, it will have big socio-economic impacts, and social safety nets will be important to them. One trend to look out for is, and we heard some about this already, but in recent years, there's been trend in low and middle income countries with oil and natural gas resources to look at the petrochemical industry as an opportunity to create economic value of their fossil resources. Also looking forward where we maybe see a decline in demand for these resources in other sectors. So it's seen as an opportunity to sustain or increase export revenues, generate economic growth, stimulate employment, and like we also heard before, if we should have a decent chance to turn the trend around, there can't be any more expansions of fossil chemical production. And my last point is also we also try to do a bit of a deep dive into the subnational scale. So that the chemical industries, they are often clustered in major production units, so geographically concentrated, which means that they often play a very important role in the local regional economies in economies of the local communities, both as a source of employment, but a source of tax revenues, and as a source of conflict, but also a source of pride. So that's something that is important to take into account when you devise policies targeting the petrochemical industry. So yeah, that sums up our part of the work, and I'll leave the word next to Carolyn, I think, to wrap it all up.
Thanks. Great. Thank you, everyone. And I wanted to start by saying also from my side, what a great pleasure it has been to work with such a fantastic team of colleagues on this report. My name is Carolyn Deer-Burbeck, and I'm a researcher at the Geneva Graduate Institute and also the director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and SDGs based in Geneva. So my part of my contribution to this report was really focused on the issue of the global governance framework for petrochemicals. And the core insight is that, of course, it's a very fragmented landscape, and there is much missing. In reality, you can't find a very clear place anywhere in global governance where petrochemicals are explicitly being addressed. So instead, you have to look across a range of different regimes, and you find bits and pieces. It's kind of a patchwork. So in global climate regime, there's nothing specifically on petrochemicals in the UNFCCC context, nor is it a sector that has been explicitly mentioned, for instance, in the Paris Agreement. You have many, alongside the UNFCCC, you have many sectoral and multi-stakeholder or multi-government initiatives on particular sectors, say on land use or on agriculture, even in terms of deep decarbonization industries. There's never one that's specifically focused on petrochemicals. We might have one on steel or on aluminium, but not on petrochemicals per se. There's some lights on the horizon that are relevant. So there's things like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is looking at fossil fuels. There are proposals for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty in the climate space that would also address some issues related to petrochemicals. There are initiatives such as the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative, but as I mentioned, it doesn't have a particular focus on petrochemicals. And similarly, we don't see any particular mention of petrochemicals in the national determined contributions of governments in the context of the UNFCCC either. So it's kind of a missing sector despite its tremendous climate impact. Another area of global governance that's relevant is around chemicals governance, and here it's a notoriously weak framework for chemicals governance at the global level. We have bits and pieces that are relevant. So the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants regulates some of the additives that are used in the petrochemical sector for plastics, for instance. The Rotterdam Convention also looks at certain hazardous chemicals, some of which are used in the petrochemicals industry. There are two initiatives, the Strategic Approach to International Chemical Management, which is an intergovernmental framework, which is also notoriously weak. There are ongoing efforts to try and strengthen that framework, but there's nothing specific there that enables us or helps us to regulate petrochemicals as such in an effective way at present. One of the areas where there's some scope for hope is on global plastics governance, where we, as you're all aware, we are in the process of developing a new global treaty. We don't know what the treaty will have in it yet, but of course there are a number of countries who have proposed that there should be control measures in the treaty related to the production of primary plastic polymers, which of course would directly address the petrochemical sector. We don't know how successful the government's calling for that will be, but we can hope that they will find a way to encourage both a reduction in the overall levels of supply and also to eliminate some of the most harmful plastic polymers as well, and to promote transparency around the production volumes of different polymers and chemicals related to that, all of which would effectively target the petrochemical sector in some way. There are other efforts underway that are relevant in global trade governments. The WTO has a dialogue on plastics pollution, and it has a work stream which is around reducing. It's called Reduction and Circularity, and they're focused on looking for ways in which trade and trade policy cooperation would help in the reduction of unnecessary and problematic, unnecessary and harmful plastics. So there's a hook there to look at the trade dimensions of the plastic sector, including looking upstream. The focus of the dialogue is specifically looking upstream. And while it covers plastics, it would look obviously at petrochemicals behind that, the further it goes upstream. What you don't have in this landscape is anything on pesticides and fertilizers specifically. Some of you may be aware that the EU's new CBAM initiative does look at fertilizers and some chemicals, which is a first sort of trade-related effort to regulate some of the trade in chemicals known to have a high climate impact. I would just mention briefly that in terms of global energy, oil and gas governance, of course, we all know it's kind of the Wild West. We don't really have effective global governance of those sectors, hence the push in the climate treaty to try and look at sort of some of the phase out of fossil fuels. But the governance of that sector itself is not one where we're going to get a lot of hope, I don't think, on the petrochemical side. There is, however, two agencies that I think are worth noting in the global governance arena is International Energy Agency and also IRENA, which is the Renewable Energy Agency. Both are very active in producing research on the petrochemical sector and are very clear about the climate impact of the sector and the need for transformation. So while they don't provide governance mechanisms themselves as actors in global governance, they offer some hope for greater attention to these sectors. And in terms of global financial governance, I would just say there that we have a lot of new initiatives trying to promote more sustainable investment by the private sector in terms of things like carbon footprint disclosure for carbon footprint disclosure, but also plastics footprint disclosure efforts that are upcoming as ways of trying to inform the investment decisions by companies. There's recent research on the risks to the insurance industry efforts to highlight the risks of investment in some of these sectors, which are relevant. And UNEP in Davos this year launched a new initiative on finance and the plastic sector, trying to look at ways that they could harness investment to sort of drive the transition. But there's no financial governance of this per se. These are just initiatives in the wider global governance landscape. I'm probably taking too much time, so I'll just skip quickly to the next slide. Yes. So just to summarize that, so there's no single regime and it's poorly addressed as a sector. In the climate regime, we have no specific focus. We do have some hope in the plastics governance arena. There are some possibilities in the chemicals governance arena, and there are some areas of trade and finance governance that could be harnessed. So what I'm going to do now is look at recommendations from the report. So here we divided our recommendations into 4 areas, and it was sort of a collective effort from those of us who contributed to different chapters of the report to look at what could make a difference. So in the first area, and I apologize, the text is a little small, but you can read the report and then you have it in a longer version. The first is around industrial organization and policies. So here there are 5 recommendations. The first is that we need to start looking seriously at restricting the expansion of production capacity. We need to require transition plans and pathways from incumbents who say they are going to transform and decarbonize to make sure this is really happening. And I would just note there's a really interesting initiative of the UN Secretary General, who has convening a climate summit in September, and he says that he will only invite and engage with industry groups there that can show up with a specific plan to show how they're going to translate their commitments that they've made in public into action. So I think this kind of idea of specific plans and pathways is very much in keeping with the spirit of the UN Secretary General in trying to keep it real and ensure we don't have greenwashing and delay on these kinds of things. We also propose that a group of first mover petrochemical firms could form a beyond fossil fuel chemicals alliance as ones who could drive change and transformation in the sector. And that obviously states who have ownership of petrochemical firms would need to push them towards transformation as well. And we also note the importance of addressing the particular challenges that developing countries have in this space. Many developing countries are looking at diversification of their oil and gas sectors into value-added industries like petrochemicals. And so we need to think hard about what can be done to address the challenges they face and their need also to generate employment and export revenue, and what can be done and what's the appropriate staging of phasing out or phasing down of this sector so that developing countries don't bear the brunt. On finance, we propose that there should be an end to public finance for fossil-based petrochemical projects, including subsidies, government-backed subsidies. We argue that asset managers, investment managers should aiming to support the transition must recognize hidden emissions in chemicals and plastics value chains and use the best available guidance to evaluate investment proposals from those issuing bonds or regulating loans. In terms of global governance, very quickly, we talk about finding ways to better integrate this governance framework and to strengthen it where we can. I mentioned before the Global Plastics Treaty, which we'll have time to discuss again later, so I won't go into it now. We also propose that petrochemicals should be more explicitly addressed in NDCs and also in potentially through a sectoral initiative in climate space, and that we will need to intensify international efforts to directly confront and reduce the scale of the fossil fuel industry as a key driver of the petrochemical industry. So it's not something that one can do alone. It's part of that bigger package with fossil fuel attention to reduction of fossil fuels more widely. So finally, the last thing we talked about was the importance of addressing public discourse and engagement. So here is that, as I mentioned before, this idea of holding companies to account for high standards for net zero goals, following best practice principles for reporting on corporate greenhouse gas emissions and moving beyond climate delay rhetoric. We talk about the importance of recognizing the harm industry does to fence-line communities and to ensuring that there's an engagement of those communities in efforts to confront and transform the petrochemicals industry, and to include them in shaping the way forward. So that's it. I hope that's a useful summary of our report, and we hope that you read it. I'll hand back over to Frederick.
Thank you all so much, Joachim, Johan, Jakob, and Caroline, for that summary of the report. And perhaps if you all come to the stage, we have some questions already from the online participants. It's also an opportunity for people in the room to ask questions, and please continue posting questions in the Q&A box. Let you just... It's come a bit circular. If you just stand in front of their chairs, behind the chair. Brilliant. Then we should see everyone also on the camera. So a bunch of questions. Jakob, you talked about the Paris Agreement and the aim of aligning financial investments with low carbon development globally. So there's a question: what are the tools to hold countries accountable for granting permits, or companies and banks accountable for investing in projects that are not aligned with these goals? I mean, are there any such tools? Can we think, otherwise, can we think of what they could be, what they could look like?
That's a very good question. I'm gonna try to answer to my best of my ability. Within the Paris Agreement, not that much of tools for holding countries, or even more so companies, accountable. Then there's the emerging field of climate litigation, of which I'm not really an expert on, but I think that could be an interesting venue for the future to see if countries could be sued, as they are being right now in other respects, for not living up to the to the Paris Agreement commitments. Also, when it comes to petrochemicals, when it comes to opening up new oil and gas fields, I think that's a topic for future research. But I think that's quite interesting. And then, in principle, also people can also, in a non-legal manner, hold companies responsible or states responsible for what they do in terms of investments, in terms of buying the products, in terms of voting government out at elections.
So no specific tools in the agreement, but
Not in the agreement, no.
But possibly more litigation. And yes, we are seeing more climate litigation, although not much of it in the petrochemicals industry yet. But some few cases, both in Europe and overseas, I think, are popping up. So you talked about trends in this industry, Johan. So there's one question about chemical recycling. Is that one of these macro trends, or not? Is that affecting the industry on a sort of significant level yet?
No, I would say it's on the margin. Like we've heard, all the major investments is going into new fossil traditional petrochemical capacity. So on the margin. But yeah, positive is some things are happening. Minor trend.
All right. Please wave if you have any questions in the room. Otherwise, we have a bunch of them from the online audience. So, Carolyn, you talked about this weak and fragmented global governance. Do we know anything sort of about the factors behind the current situation? Can we sort of say why it is so fragmented, or is it simply an effect of development over time?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think, in general, global governance is fragmented because we have these different regimes. And so some come out of environment ministries, out of energy ministries, out of trade ministries. So we get different parts of government create regimes for dealing with the problems that they want. And I think across global governance, partly what we're trying to do is to connect the dots between those. So even if you're trying to talk about decarbonization of shipping, you might need, some of that might belong in an energy ministry, some of it might belong in a transportation ministry, and some with the climate ministry, some with the trade ministry. So I think that's a common kind of challenge that we have. But I would also say here that the petrochemical industry and the chemical industry more broadly has been highly effective, and the fossil fuel industry, in making sure across these fora that there are not binding constraints on their activities. So I think that they're very effective, whether it's on chemicals governance. In the plastics regime, we will surely have them lobbying for no restriction, they will sort of be lobbying against efforts to reduce the supply of plastic polymers. We find them in the climate regime, trying to constrain ambition. So I think that's one of the reasons why we see constrained ambition everywhere. If I may, I just wanted to add a comment to what you said about climate litigation, because I was thinking it's a very good question, and we do address it partly in the report about how we can constrain investment. Are there tools for accountability? And I was thinking, in addition to litigation, there's also scope to use different parts of the investment sector to hold other parts of the sector accountable. And so you have this with some of the most cutting edge sustainable investors saying, we're not going to invest in X and Y anymore, and encourage, and sort of making that be a reputational sort of risk to be investing in that. And I think similarly, insurance companies, for example, I know with the transportation of plastic pellets, around the world, they have been very active saying, well, it's too risky, and they don't want to insure the transportation of them because of the spillage into the natural environment and the risk, reputational risk associated with insuring that. So I think there's ways that you can play other parts of the financial industry to push change, but I don't know if that will get us accountability, but it might be a tool in the toolbox.
And as a follow-up, so under the German presidency of the G7 last year, a new international climate club was launched. And one of the sort of focus areas of this was to advance industrial transformation and climate change mitigation. So do we think that this could be one vehicle to enhance the global governance of the petrochemical industry through these sort of lead countries or globally very important economies? And what could that look like? What do we know about the sort of potential for the G7 to move and be leaders on issues such as international governance, but also on climate change and issues such as fossil fuel subsidies, perhaps? So that's Carolyn, and then I'll...
Sure. I mean, I think that G7 countries taking responsibility for their own emissions and carbon footprint is always extremely important, and they will need to work with each other. They're all high emitters, so we need them to take action and be ambitious, including in this sector. And if the climate club is a way in which they think that they can collaborate better, it has some potential. I personally have very not impressed by the concept of a club. I don't think it is it's a very useful language. It has a particular origin around proposals for clubs, which are very much trying to exclude those who are not part of alliances in ways I just don't think are going to work. So I don't think the discourse is useful in any way. If you have it, call it a coalition, call it an alliance of high ambition countries, but the idea of a club is also misleading because it's not really a climate club in the way that it's discussed in the literature. It's more like a bunch of countries trying to try harder on climate. Good, why not? On the petrochemical sector, definitely. But I think that it's probably naive to assume that countries like Saudi Arabia, China, and a range of developing countries that have interest in the petrochemical sector are going to join the G7 in a G7-led initiative that they had no place in designing or being involved in the first place. But it's not to say it's not important. I just don't think it's going to be the answer. I mean, you know, it will be a driver which can be harnessed, but maybe Jakob disagrees with me. I don't know.
Not that much. And I got to be careful not to use the word club then.
Yeah.
I'll call it forum or unilateral initiative then. But you're right, it's often not a club in the club good sense. I think that look at experience from finance and from fossil fuel subsidies, smaller initiatives, both within the G20, which was really what brought fossil fuel subsidies onto the international agenda back in 2009. It played an important role in carving out a space, getting an issue on the agenda, something that later, in the case of UFC, much later, spilled over onto other international institutions. We saw a much faster process when it came to finance, where you saw smaller groups of countries making commitments on ending, for this overseas development aid for fossil fuel production, other kinds of financial commitments that said, as a small group of countries, starting with those who are very, very kind of leading on the issue, getting together and say, we commit to not financing this activity anymore. We'll stop doing so. And the Glasgow summit, and all of this actually spelled over into the UNFCCC text. And in that sense, they can play an important role, because one of the issues with the UNFCCC is that it requires something that's, if not anonymity, then something that's very close to anonymity. So very often countries that benefit enormously from fossil fuel subsidies, from fossil fuels, to block this, like Saudi Arabia has blocked a lot of initiatives. And in smaller forms, you can create this kind of momentum to bring it onto the agenda to a point where it becomes very hard for one country to block this. That said, I think fossil fuel subsidies, it's still very much an open question how much it will affect the now almost 14-year-old commitment to reform or phase out fossil fuel subsidies from the G20 has had on fossil fuel subsidies within the G20. So I think that there are limits to how much they can do something. They can bring things onto the agenda. They can make perhaps certain kind of actions more difficult. But I think they need to be seen is in terms of like the wider governance architecture and how they might lead to commitments within, for instance, the UNFCCC or other fora. I wouldn't just focus blindly on the UNFCCC.
Any questions in the room? Yes, Tobias. Yeah, thanks a lot for this amazing report. So you learned a lot about petrochemicals, you learned a lot about the challenges of changing it. So if you could, each of you sort of reflect, what has been sort of the positive story? Has there been anything, the good news? What have you been surprised with? What is sort of the silver lining here? Maybe just one point or something that you would like to raise.
Is there a silver lining to all this, or have any positive developments struck us in this work? So Caroline, you waved, so let's I think it will have to be our final question. So let's move through the panel, start with Caroline.
I mean, I think to me, the silver lining is, I think even in the 3 years of the project, and hopefully we had something to do in stimulating this, I think that the connection between the petrochemical sector, the climate and the plastics crisis is now increasingly well established. And so the fact, I think 3 years ago when we first started this project, there was the idea of a treaty that might look at marine plastic pollution, and the idea that it's now looking at the full life cycle of plastics, including the petrochemicals. The primary products is at least on the agenda. Many countries, over 50 countries, have made submissions saying that this should be addressed in some way in the treaty. I think really shows that. And also that in their submissions, they've made the link between the plastics crisis and as a contributor to the climate crisis. I think that's starting to reshape that. And I also think that it's positive that we have more about chemicals on the climate agenda than we did a few years ago. And hopefully things like these, I don't mean to sound too pessimistic about the G7. I mean, we have key countries who are willing to make the links, to connect the dots. And so I think that's good news. Yeah.
I mean, I'm new to this, so I cannot really witness the same kind of development as you can. When you first said silver linings, good news, I would say there are some great people working on this, so and that's hopefully a start. But when Caroline was talking, I was thinking, yeah, I think there's so much more for growing awareness, and that's positive, and that's in a way that's probably a necessary condition for action. It's not far from sufficient, but it's a very important necessary condition to be aware of this linkage of petrochemicals, and also, again, sorry, drawing on something I know a bit more about, fossil fuels. I think that people are so much more focused on the financing and the upstream element of fossil fuels. The importance of not just looking at the demand side, but also supply of fossil fuels, which means it may be so much easier in the future to make them aware of the upstream element of petrochemicals compared to 5-10 years ago. So I think that some of the didactical preparation work has been made.
Yeah, and so I spent a lot of time on steel industry and the cement industry. So I think I bring my silver lining from there, because they were also used to, you're not allowed to use the word hard to abate, but there were 10 years ago, if you spoke about the transition in the steel industry, you heard a lot. It's the same story as we see in the petrochemical industry. Maybe it's a harder nut to crack in a way, but a lot have shifted in those two industries, and that gives me hope that it's possible in the petrochemical industry as well.
I think, I mean, I would end by saying that the framing of this report, right, is about login. So maybe we didn't set out to look for silver linings necessarily, first and foremost, but perhaps more map the challenges, and then, you know, the discussion from here and panels later, hopefully, right, and the keynote we will hear here in a short while is much about, okay, then how do we do it, right? How do we go from these challenges or these barriers, these logins? I would say, though, I mean, mirroring and resonating, I guess, with what some of us did, both that it's more on the agenda, that the links are more present, and that there's also, to me at least, there is a sense that this is not just going to be a technocratic issue of sitting down and then figuring out how to do this in a technocratic top-down manner. That this is also about, or what is visible is that this is also about vested interests, and that there is going to be social contestation around this. And I guess what then my silver lining is that I see a lot of groups, movements that are, say, aware of this and act in accordance with the knowledge that this is not going to be something that is an easy compromise or going to happen without social struggle. So yeah, that's my silver lining.
I think we have to move on in the program. So there are lots of questions remaining, so then we will have the opportunity to address in the panels. So hang on and wait for those. Thank you so much for presentations and on. And with that, I would like to welcome to the stage Professor Jonathan Cullen from the University of Cambridge, where you are a professor in sustainable engineering. Yeah. You also lead a research project on carbon clarity in the petrochemical value chain, and have done great work in trying to model and figure out what are the different pathways to a planet-compatible chemicals industry. So if we are able to move beyond these barriers that we have talked a lot about in the first session, what could future developments look like? Please.
Thank you. Thank you all, and those online. And just to say how much I've enjoyed reading the report. And so thank you to all the authors. It's been really, it's a really nice piece of work. It's really cohesive, which has been lovely to kind of look at, and really complements the work we've been doing in this sister project. I'm Jonathan Cullen. I lead a group called Resource Efficiency Collective at Cambridge. We're trying to work out ways of delivering what people want with less energy, less materials, less carbon, etc., less impact. And as Frederick said, we have been leading a project called Carbon Clarity in the Global Petrochemical Supply Chain, See-Through. And I guess there's two main aims of this project. It's a sister project funded by the same group. Two main aims. One is to kind of create the kind of most comprehensive, transparent data set of emissions from the petrochemical industry. And as we're trying to do that, we realize the numbers are just, hugely inaccurate. Orders of magnitude, 1 order times 10 difference in the LCA numbers we're getting. So we're trying to pull that together across countries, across products, across different greenhouse gas emissions, across different life cycle stages. And so that will be some kind of dashboard that goes online, open source for people. Probably not at the plant level. It gets a little bit more tricky with confidentiality data. But the second area is looking kind of into the future and saying what options, what pathways, what interventions have we got to decarbonize this industry or to reduce the emissions from it. The type of work we do, some of you have seen this. This is a map by myself and Peter Levi, who's now at the International Energy Agency, leading the industrial work, trying to push as hard as possible on material efficiency there. But this is a map of the chemical industry and the material flowing through it. So 40 different processes, all balanced chemically. And it gives you kind of a feel of the complexity of this industry. We did steel, we did concrete, we did glass, we did aluminium first because chemicals was the most challenging. And you get some, out of this type of work, you get some of the numbers that we're only recycling 12% of our plastics, for instance. So you get these kind of numbers coming through. Just to shout out as well to my colleague Andre Serenho and Yin Yunhu Gao, who just produced a map here in Nature Food of petrochemical of nitrogen fertilizers and their emissions intensity, which is really interesting. And you know, some highlights there are showing that if you move across to a manure-based system, you actually produce more emissions. And 2/3 of our emissions come from when we put the fertilizer on the ground, not from actually making them in the first place. So there's some real challenges in this industry. Today, I want to present on this kind of this idea of planet compatible chemicals industry. We've written a paper in PNS on this, and there's also a report that we're involved with that was from the Global Centre for Global Commons and Systemic. And so this, I just want to present the kind of work we did there, give you an idea of how we're trying to frame this problem of where the industry might go. Why planet boundaries? Because we know that chemicals are impacting a number of the boundaries, particularly around biosphere, freshwater use, biochemical flows, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosols, these novel entities, ozone. The one we're focusing on in our project is the climate change one, but I just want to say it's not a one-dimensional problem, and there's many good people working on other aspects of this as well. And I think we can all agree that the petrochemical industry touches on, you know, everything from plastic waste, toxicity near plants, microplastics, but also emissions. And so emissions is where I'm focusing. When we think about the kind of the solution space or a net zero emission solution space, I think there's kind of two unhelpful narratives that are going on in the moment at the extremes of this kind of imaginary line. One is a kind of business as usual. We just keep building plants and we just do some CCS and we'll decarbonize. Okay, completely unrealistic because of the multitude of impacts from plants, but also because of the technologies aren't scaling, they're not really there. At the other end, I think we've got a kind of a, you know, let's just ban all plastics. Let's just get rid of the whole petrochemical sector. Let's go 100% circular. And I think that's equally as unhelpful because it breaks some of the laws of thermodynamics, 100% circularity. And you need to be really careful if you're going to ban all plastics, what the alternatives might be. And often the alternatives can be worse in many cases. So we think there's some kind of solution space that's got to be in between here. And that's why it's so important to bring together the kind of production end and the demand end, some space where there's some net zero solutions, where you've got a mix of supply options and demand options going together. So in the work, we set up scenarios, 7 scenarios, and you'll see this supply demand coming through in my talk a lot. So on the demand side, a business as usual scenario, a low circularity scenario, and a high circularity scenario. And on the supply, a most economic, a no new fossil build after 2030, and a no fossil build from today. And I'll just say that the NFAX one we brought in because we realize it's very hard to stop the plants that are already financed and are being built up to 2030. But we thought beyond 2030, you might be able to stop any new fossil fuel build. So I'll go through a little bit, some detail around what those scenarios look at. Obviously, these are imagined pictures of the future, but based on lots of what might be technologically achievable, but of course not necessarily politically or socially or with the lock-in that we've just been talking about. So on the demand end, I'll start with ammonia. One of the things that we see is a massive increase in ammonia demand. And this is if you believe in a net zero world and you believe you still want to be able to ship things. At the moment, we think ammonia is the only way of fueling ships. And a lot of power generation will need to move over to ammonia as well. So you're seeing our current numbers, 185, some increase in ammonia use for kind of fertilizer up to 2050 in a business as usual scenario. And then this just massive increase in ammonia production to deliver these things. Now, maybe we'll come up with a different solution for shipping, but at the moment we can't see another net zero solution. Then you do some demand reduction circularity, and there's very little we think you can do on circularity for fertilizer production, etc., because you can't recycle it essentially. So there's the kind of demand reduction is very limited here. Moving to plastics and chemicals, there's mixed, you know, in our work we separate them out, but I've just brought them together. We do see demand increasing out to 2050. So maybe not a doubling, which is what many say, but maybe half as much added. So that's increasing use of chemicals and plastics. And then there's a big chunk of extra methanol, mainly the purple there. And that's because to produce a lot of plastics with no carbon, you need to start going through a methanol route. All of your biotype feedstocks need to go through a methanol route. So there's a lot of methanol added. But in this case, with plastics, you can do quite a lot of demand reduction. So we're doing kind of eliminating, you know, we don't need to use plastic, reusing, longer life, substituting for other products, and recycling options. They're giving us this kind of 33% reduction in the low circularity and a 51% reduction in a high circularity. That's quite aggressive. The IEA would probably sit at about 25–30% reduction. So a 50% reduction in use is quite aggressive. And I'm giving you a breakdown of some of the chemicals there that you would use. So that's kind of demand side, where we think in the kind of contribution of that demand. We're not getting to zero. You're not getting 100% circularity. Definitely impossible. You can't just ban all plastics and all ammonia, or else you can't feed the world. Just to show those demand patterns again, just that scale of change going on. I've just picked out two of the scenarios: the low circularity, most economic, and the low circularity, no fossil fuel beyond 30. Massive increase in this ammonia going on, massive increase in methanol going on in these scenarios, but actually a decrease in the olefins and aromatics that we're making from that circularity putting in. Moving over to supply, and what you get here is a scale of the change we're talking about. And given we've just heard about how much lock-in and how difficult that is to change, you know, you're seeing this in the ammonia and derivatives. You've got your traditional routes here in the kind of gray, and then you just got this massive chunk of electrolysis by green hydrogen. No one knows if we can build that much green hydrogen. No one knows if we can get the renewables to power it either. But that's the scale of kind of hydrogen you're going to have to do for ammonia, all from electrolysis. No blue hydrogen going on. And the non-ammonia chemicals, so this is again plastics and other chemicals, it's a bit more complicated, but in the kind of, you know, business as usual, you're seeing still quite a lot of steam cracking, the kind of in gas reforming, the purple in there. But in the most economic, you're seeing a lot of abatement of those with CCS. And in the no fossil fuel, you see even more kind of variability in the types of routes that you're going to have to make these chemicals with. Looking at that from a feedstock point of view, again, just picking up these two scenarios, fossil fuels in gray. Most economic, you see a reduction, but still quite a lot of fossil fuel. That's getting to zero or close to zero carbon by using alternative heating sources and CCS. In the no fossil fuel, obviously you've got to bring in lots of biomass, lots of direct air capture, lots of point source, which is carbon coming from other parts of the economy or other industries to reach those targets. From an infrastructure requirement point of view, it's interesting. Up the top here, I'm just showing what will need to change under this LCME, the most economic scenario. So you're seeing about 12%, 14% of your steam crackers or your initial existing plants being decommissioned, but a huge chunk of them needing to be retrofitted. But that is completely dwarfed by the the new plants that need to be made to deliver all this extra ammonia and methanol going on. So we need to make sure those plants that are built zero carbon. And also we need to hold account the existing companies to decarbonize and existing or retrofit their plants. Just a bit more nuance. This is just looking at steam crackers down the bottom here. The LCME is the one we're seeing in the top, but if you move away from fossil fuels, the purple really comes down quickly because you're moving away, and you've got to find a lot more bioethanol. You've got to find a lot more CCU and kind of other ways of getting carbon into the system. The issue there is you run out of carbon to use to make these petrochemicals or these chemical products. So that's interesting because a lot of those technologies are very hard, very new, very difficult, and we don't know. We probably think that that's why most economic is just to retrofit existing plants and structures that we've got. Thinking about enabling technologies here, at the top we've got carbon capture and storage. So this is giving you an idea of business as usual. Most sector has lots of CCS going on, but as you move towards these kind of low carbon routes, circularity routes, you have a lot less CCS. So this is a trade-off between the demand solutions and the kind of CCS solutions going on. But at the bottom, you've got this MTX plants, huge growth, that's methanol to olefin and aromatic plants, huge growth in electrolyzers, huge growth in renewable energies that's required. I wanted to show some sand keys. I'm running out of time, Frederick's telling me. So this is just showing you the changes that kind of go on. This is the current system, what it looks like, lots of fossil fuel, lots of leakage at the end. You move across to these low circularity, all of these new loops, so new circularity loops, new businesses that need to be created, still quite a lot of fossil fuels coming through. If you take away the fossil fuel, suddenly you've got these pressures on biomass and direct air capture, biomass pressures on forests, etc. Direct air capture, difficult technology, expensive to deliver what you're trying to deliver. And overall in these scenarios, so only the high circularity ones actually get to zero. The other ones get very close to that. There's some residual emissions around fertilizer use when you put it on the ground. These high circularity ones have a little bit of negative emissions that can bring you down. But we're getting quite big chunks. The business as usual is kind of up at 8, so we're getting big reductions. 2 things just to leave with you, if that's all right. One is that kind of thoughts to try and understand this at a higher, more abstract level. One is this idea that currently we take carbon from the ground, left hand, and put it into the atmosphere, business as usual. And what we need to move towards is either taking carbon from the air, putting it back into the air, or taking carbon from the ground and putting it back into the ground. And so there's technologies around those 2, direct air capture, bio takes carbon from the air. And then we could still maybe burn our plastics at the end, and that would balance the carbon. And 2 there, you can take, fossil fuels, and you can use CCS, feels risky to me, or you can put plastics back in the ground. And they can be close to neutral, but really where we want to go is to invert the carbon vector to where we're taking carbon from the atmosphere, from trees, from direct air capture, from other sources, and putting it into the ground. And then you might get some negative emission kind of traction from this industry. And it is, I think, one of the few scalable negative emissions places that we might be able to actually do it. Huge challenge, but could do it. The second one is just around carbon. I talked before that you start to run out of carbon. So this is your carbon sources. We've got fossil fuels from recycled material and from kind of bio or direct air capture type methods. And these become limited because if you do fossil fuels in a zero carbon, you have to do CCS on the other end. And we think the scalability of CCS is really challenging. Recyclates are limited by how much we recycle. We don't think we can recycle more than about 50% of plastic because of the entropy involved. If you want to incinerate, you have to be balancing that with carbon from the air, from either biosources or FAC. And so we've got these limitations, particularly on the C, F, and E, which restrict the amount of carbon we can actually get into the system. And anything else has to come from demand reduction if you want to make these products for people. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So we have time for just 2 questions, perhaps. But there's one. So you mentioned this explosive growth in ammonia that you also say is perhaps one of the most sort of uncertain factors or points in these scenarios that you have built. And are there sort of ways of reducing that demand? What would that mean? Sort of not having that in there. Have you look at that?
Not shipping anything. So maybe in a world where we all put the borders up and fight every other country in the world, we can shut down the borders and don't ship anything. And we bring manufacturing capability back into countries, but I can't see that happening in a free world. So that ammonia is the only realistic solution we see for shipping.
And that's basically it.
Well, there are other ideas out there, and who knows, maybe we'll invent something else, but it's challenging. The key is, though, if you're going to build these ammonia plants, they have to be from green electrolysis hydrogen, because you don't want the CO2 from them.
And there's also a question about where could we expect that sort of large scale green hydrogen to be produced? What does that do with sort of global trade patterns? Have you looked at where that sort of happens? Is your model, are your scenarios geographically explicit, or sort of global in terms of geography?
Mostly global, and I think there is a need to go down to regional. But one of the things we were picking up is that the existing kind of petrochemical facilities, if they're going to convert across, in some cases struggle to find sufficient renewable energy to do the hydrogen through electrolysis. So there could be a challenge there. And one of the reasons why methanol maybe looks quite exciting, but as an option, is because it's a high density fuel you can transport. So there might be routes where you make methanol in one place and transport it to the existing facilities to convert into olefins.
So we had some questions in the room.
Thank you for the presentation. So in most of your decarbonization scenario, you mobilize some similar narrative than the industry can mobilize around, like different technological options. You mentioned that some of them were new, that a lot of them were unproven. When you talk about CCS, it is not new. It's been around for about 2 decades. It's been proven repeatedly that it actually doesn't really work. On other technologies that you've been mentioning, like chemical recycling or even CCUS, do you have tangible examples of plants that are financially viable, that function, and that have an actual positive impact on carbon emissions?
Yeah, lots in there. CCS, I think, is a technology we can do, but I don't think it's scalable. And I think we've seen a move in the steel industry away from CCS to hydrogen, and I think we'll probably see a similar move. At the moment, a lot of the petrochemicals are saying they're going to do CCS. A lot of them don't have reservoirs to put in, etc. So I think the move would go towards hydrogen. There's also electrification, but hydrogen seems to be the cheaper option there. I can't remember the other things. CCU.
For recycling and CCUS.
Yeah, so, you know, whether we can take carbon from another industry, cement, say, and put it into plastics, that then end up in society, and where the carbon is locked in, at least for some time. That'd be an example of CCU. Not sure about scalability. I would say, you know, at a higher level, the kind of industry plans are very risky, and I am certainly very wary of that risk. We've said for a long time CCS is not happening and probably won't happen. That's my stance, which is why it's so important that you go really hard on the demand reduction, which requires governments to actually start regulating around plastics, around circularity, etc.
Yeah, thank you for an interesting presentation. I have also a question about the ammonia. You say that you only see that as the only option for shipping. How come? Is it because of the lack of carbon in ammonia versus like methanol, which is starting to gain ground in shipping?
I mean, I think the limitations are more around the, you know, biofuel, which is the alternative, and producing enough biofuel for shipping. You know, it's not my area, but I'm told would be really disastrous in terms of the amount of trees we'd have to grow and cut down all the time. So there are trade-offs there, obviously, but biofuel is the main alternative. Don't think we can use batteries in the electricity in that space.
Methanol can be produced from hydrogen as well. It's probably less efficient.
Yeah, so yeah.
All right. I think we have to move on. We are already a bit behind and a bit late into our coffee break. So let's take 12 minutes coffee break and be back around 2:50. So in 12 minutes. And let's continue the discussion over coffee. And those of you at home, get your legs, grab some coffee. See you back shortly. All right, welcome back. And we're moving on to our first panel session. Glad to have again on stage Jakob Skovgaard, who is Associate Professor in Political Science here at Lund University and was part of the team doing this research. We're also very glad to have two guests with us for this panel. Tridivesh Dey, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Global Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark, and Delphine Levy-Alvarez, who is a global petrochemical campaigns coordinator with the Center for International Environmental Law, CL, based in Brussels. Right. And so I would first, or the topic of this panel is to discuss the connections between petrochemicals and fossil fuels and sort of what that means in terms of addressing this channel or this challenge. How do we think about the connection? How do we make this connection visible? And what does it mean for any other types of interventions that we have this close connection? But I would like to start with offering you, everyone in the panel, 3 minutes for some introductory remarks, and then we'll move into a discussion. And there's also an opportunity for both people in the room and for those of you attending online to ask questions to the panel. But let me start with you, Tridivesh, as you are closest to me.
Thank you. I think the report is very timely and it's so important. It really talks about and visibilizes a very complexly distributed industry, globally distributed industry, which is very difficult to identify and study, identify to its points of tension, but also opportunities. I'm speaking as a plastic scientist with home in anthropology. I work with different communities, in part in South and Southeast Asia. I work with different practical experts, communities of practice. As an anthropologist, I have observed the effects of plastics and petrochemical pollution in different spaces, in communities. So we're talking about environmental, social, and sanitary impacts of plastics and petrochemicals and plastic associated chemicals. From that regard, we're also talking about the sheer volume and chemical complexity of plastics, which complicate efforts to remediate plastics, which complicate waste management, for example. It's costly and technically arduous to separate certain chemical additives from plastics, for example, which kind of compromises, jeopardizes efforts of circular economy. It renders it unsafe as well. So from that aspect, I think calling for production cap for plastics is very important, but also it's very important to for industries to be transparent about the chemicals that they use in plastics, which eventually interact and accumulate in all sorts of ways in products, but also in the environments across processes. It's very important to regulate these chemicals too. So from that aspect, one of the points of my curiosity in this report is to really, is that it really obliges us to think about how production reduction can be difficult or difficult to regulate and reduce, but also the focus about the petrochemical use in plastics. What kind of regimes, legal, economic, political, that are protecting and propagating these kinds of use.
Right, thank you. Jakob, you've been also working a lot previously with fossil fuel subsidies, for example, that was raised already previously. But please, what strikes you as most important, most pertinent in this connection between these two industries?
Yeah, I mean, you gave me this assignment a few days ago, and I thought about it, and then I planned to say something, and then I changed that slightly after the discussion an hour ago. So I started to say something to be as advertised or asked us if you could say something positive. And in a way, I think we can see this in a positive light, in the sense that a lot of the expansion and the connection between fossil fuels and petrochemicals is due to a success story, namely that there is an ongoing transition when it comes to the power production, electricity production, whereas a growing amount, or especially expectation, there will be a much higher share of renewable energy, and hence also a much lower demand for oil and natural gas. And people also expect the same kind of transition to take place within transportation, so be much larger share of electric vehicles. And that's where some of the, at least politically very pertinent, connection between petrochemicals and fossil fuels take place, beyond the fact that petrochemicals are made out of fossil fuels. Then the connection takes place in the background of reduced demand for fossil fuels in the electricity sector, or expected reduced demand for fossil fuels in the electricity sector and in the transportation sector. And one can think of this as a kind of larger scale lock-in, so that when fossil fuel consumption is threatened within one part, it doubles down. A large part of the fossil fuel sector really doubles down and try to increase or offset this reduced demand within the petrochemical sector. And as I said before, and that also a bit drawing on my kind of experience as somebody working on fossil fuel subsidies, a lot of this is tied in with the role of the public sector and the state, but also international organizations, multilateral development banks. And this is more salient in countries where there is a larger fossil fuel sector, unsurprisingly. But it's actually something that takes place, and also something that I think it's evident in some of the stuff that's in the report. It's something that's evident in all countries. And I would say that one of the fundamental problems in dealing with the climate crisis, and probably also the sustainability crisis, more broadly speaking, is that states and their agents on the international level, the international organization, international regimes, are schizophrenic in the sense they have a green hand that try to address climate issues, environmental issues, but they also have a black hand that actually works to exacerbate these problems by handing out fossil fuel subsidies, by financing chemical plants, providing export credits for petrochemical plants, doing other things, also beyond petrochemicals, such as supporting the expansion of highways, of airports. And I think that that's kind of where we see sort of the connection between petrochemical and fossil fuels in the kind of more fundamental lock-in on the global level in all societies, and where it was very hard to address petrochemicals, perhaps because it becomes harder to address petrochemicals because we are starting to see successful transitions within other sectors.
Thank you. And Delphine, what's what's been most striking to you in trying to understand how this industry affects people and communities around the world in the work that you've been doing?
So I think the most striking thing for me is that we don't talk about it more. Because that's how the report starts, saying that it's one of it's the actual industrial sector that uses the most fossil fuel and as feedstock and energy for an extremely energy intensive process. And still it's very rarely discussed when we talk about energy transition, when we talk about energy security, when we talk about fighting the climate crisis. And it just doesn't make any sense that we are not addressing that sector. And I think one of the reasons why we're not addressing that sector is coming back to Tobias' question about what's positive. There's nothing easy about the transition of the petrochemicals industry. That's why we actually end up with lots of false solutions, technological fixes that we don't even know if they work, or we actually know they don't work, but people who are promoting them are counting on the fact that people don't know that they don't work. And people are having this whole conversation about transitioning an industry where the best decarbonization strategy for such an industry is reduce massively the amount of things that they're producing. And that brings us back to some of the conversations, these interventions. It is not about demand. Most of it is actually about offer. This is like plastic pollution is not a demand-driven issue. We don't have plastic and we don't have the pollution that results from plastic because people demand plastic. We have it because at some point we have an industry, the fossil fuel industry, that has found that there was a lot of added value in producing this material, and they were just going to find ways to have an output for their product. And we end up having this conversation about demand, while the real conversation is about the supply. It's a supply-driven issue. In 1977, you had an article in the New York Times that was saying that it was already a supply-driven issue at the time. They were looking at the commercial strategies of fossil fuel companies in trying to sell their different products and chemicals to companies and create products that people didn't need because they didn't even know it existed. So now we are going back to saying, yeah, but people want that. No, people don't want that. Like the narrative of this industry is that people need that, people want that. Well, when you look at some leaked documents, you actually realize how much the boom of single-use plastic in Asia is a commercial strategy to create needs that didn't exist in the first place. And this is all because this is the lifeline of the fossil fuel industry. This is a sector they are investing in massively, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars are being invested by this industry to produce different kind of petrochemicals. And there is a total gap between what's happening in reality in terms of investments and build out and the decarbonization narrative of the plastic industry or even the agrochemicals industry. And this is all because they're just counting on the fact that we're not going to see where this is going if it's not going to their sector. If you want to produce a lot of bio-based plastic because you want to remove the fossil fuel-based feedstock, you're going to need a lot of agrochemicals to grow the crops that you need to replace your fossil feedstock by bio-based feedstock. So you're going to need a lot of agrochemicals that are coming from the very same industry. So if we're not looking at it from a holistic perspective, we're going to create waterbed effects. And we're already seeing these waterbed effects because everything that's happening now on petrochemicals is a direct result of the great work that has been done on reducing the fossil fuel consumption in the energy and the transport sector. So it's just going somewhere else. And as long as we're not identifying it as the exit door for that industry, we're going to lose on other fronts. And as long as we're addressing plastic without addressing agrochemicals, without addressing chemicals, we're also not going to reduce the amount of fossil fuels that are extracted. And this comes at a high cost, not only for, we can count CO2 emissions as much as we want. What I'm looking at when I work with communities is the actual health impact on people, on their environment, how we are durably damaging soils where we can't grow anything anymore because it's too polluted. So I can continue on and on, but I only have 3 minutes. So I'll stop here and we'll probably come back to some of these points.
Yes. No, I think so. This whole project started from or had its starting point in a sort of climate change mitigation angle. But as we also point to in this report, and that you will also point to both the Trade is how this is connected to many other issues and sort of emerging crises globally, and that's a very important to remember when talking about interventions and strategies for transformation. There's also, I mean, differences in terms of what this, what is the understanding of this industry in different communities, in different regions globally. And perhaps, we're in Europe and having this discussion where perhaps this is to a large degree a climate problem. But what do we know sort of about this? How is the challenge or the challenges for transforming this industry perceived and understood in different parts of the world? Tridebesh, you've been doing lots of your research in South Asia, and Delphine, I know you're also working together with communities from all over the world. Tridebesh, what have you sort of come across any significant differences in how we understand the challenges around the world? Because we know that this is a global industry, and perhaps we still have to think about regionally specific ways of making it visible, making it clear what a sort of transformation has to entail and can give. Yes, Tridebesh, you first.
I can speak from my fieldwork experiences in I can talk about experiences in rural India, where I can see plastic packaged products and plastic objects, commodified plastic objects, creating and reinforcing a bottom of the pyramid commerce, for example. At one level, it is a question of finding new markets, creating new demands. But at the same time, there is also a more political question of the democratization of consumption, different narratives of growth and development and claims to a good life. So, and those kinds of philosophical questions really complicate the question of what is important, what are the priorities, right? And we see parts of that in climate change negotiations around contribution and responsibility in carbon emissions and such. The practical level, especially India has claimed to take a big role in plastic remediation, in global plastic remediation, for example. But in practice, what that transforms into is a lot of waste to energy and chemical recycling plants and projects being promoted at the very federal level, which of course has a huge greenhouse gas emission and impacts on the carbon accounting. So at the same time, there are also efforts to sequester the plastic, like carbon capture and storage or utilization in different kinds of open loop recycling projects and reusing these plastic waste, channelizing them into alternative infrastructures of use in infrastructure in the basic qualities of life for people, which again create further lock-in for the demands and sequestration of plastic waste. But at the same time, it also maintains the petrochemical sector of India, which is largely private, but with Reliance Industries, for example, which figures in your report, which enjoys a more than 50% share, capital share in the Indian plastics and petrochemicals sectors. But it also kind of speaks to the political and economic relations that are in place, that all these kinds of chemical recycling or chemical sequestration, carbon sequestration projects are maintaining is not a call for reducing demands, but the kind of invisibilizing or respatializing in terms of smoke and emissions, the actual visible, tangible plastic waste that are necessarily being produced with all these production and consumption.
Right. Delphine, you're nodding a lot, but is there anything, have you sort of seen, or is it evident in the work that you've been doing that this is, I don't know, more visible in some regions or creating more conflicts, for example, with local groups in some regions more than in others? And if so, what are the particular points of conflict that become evident in different parts of the world? And is climate one of them at all?
The climate is definitely one of them, but most communities will fight for their right to a healthy environment first and foremost. And what I find interesting in your question is like what's visible for us means that at some point there was the freedom and the capacity for the groups to communicate that and have the message going to us or coming to us. You have lots of places in the world where it's just not safe to expose the wrongdoings of industry. You have in India a few journalists who were killed after reporting on petrochemicals build out and the functioning of the fossil fuel industry. So there are a lot of things that we just don't know about because they're not communicated first in English or because it's dangerous to communicate them. And then coming back to the question on litigation earlier, yes, litigation is a fantastic tool, but it requires so much money. And lots of groups on the ground do not have this kind of resources. And when they engage in litigation, they are also exposing themselves to threats, if not more. Some of the communities that have been working the most are in the United States, and there it's mostly affecting communities of color and First Nations. You have a perpetuation of this genocide on the First Nations by just taking over the land, having pipelines going on the land, having desalination plants polluting their water, taking their clean water, and all the petrochemical sort of web of installations that is affecting them in all the ways. And then in communities of color, like communities who majoritarily speak Spanish, you will have companies that only communicate in English. And so people will not have the actual information about it. The only thing that they know is that it actually provides jobs for the community, but we're talking about jobs that have a really high impact on health. And you have accidents all the time. Like just on the 5th of May, there was a giant fire at the Shell refinery in Houston, Texas. A couple of months ago, there was a crazy train derailment in Ohio where you had chemical like vinyl chloride first and foremost, but other kind of chemicals that were just like first like spilling over on the floor, and then they were set on controlled fire, and then you had this like giant mushroom of cloud, and pets died, and farm animals died, and so you have all these things that are just like right there, and we hear a lot about the ones that come from the US, but I was recently in Asia for a meeting, and what I heard there from the activists, you never hear that anywhere else because they just can't say the same thing the same way. And you just realize how much impact there are for people, and how much there is also shame and fear about talking about that. Like if you look at Senegal, for example, BP has an offshore drilling platform there with a local Senegalese company, and there were articles in the press that were reporting how they basically have closed for access the most fertile fishing water for the population there, and people do not have income anymore. So it's pushing women to prostitute themselves to put food on the table. And these are the kind of impacts that we're like just really not talking about. And every time those companies have a platform that these people do not have. And when they are in these platforms, they're using that to promote their tiny little project here, social thing, tiny little decarbonization investment there. And we're not talking about the real impact on people and on the environment around them. That is just, like essentially the thing that we've been calling out for decades on fossil fuel extraction. It's what's happening with petrochemicals and has been happening and will happen more and more with the build out that we're looking at. And we need to talk about that.
Yes, and Jakob, so one of the things that we looked at in the report was also, what countries are investing, and in this sort of relating to what countries do we see sort of strategically making a movement towards investing in petrochemicals, right? And what we know about their connection to fossil fuels, and also what we've been hearing from Delphine just now, where we know that around fossil fuel extraction, etc., there's a long history of conflicts and abuse and violence, right? So what do we know about the countries that are now investing in petrochemicals and their history when regarding activities in fossil fuel extraction, processing, and trade, etc.?
I think there's two kinds of countries investing in one level in petrochemicals. Those who invest in them within their own territory, and that's kind of the countries that are most invested in it, so to speak, and probably the ones you're referring to, and they tend to be either countries that are already fossil fuel producing, or the countries that would like to be, like Mozambique, for instance, which is one of the case studies where there's a lot of hopes. There's already some fossil fuel extraction, but there's hope to focus a lot more on and get a lot more revenue from fossil gas. I should say fossil gas rather than natural gas. That's often referred to, and it's often countries that don't have so many alternatives, and that's to build a bit on what you say, and which also a commonality with fossil fuel extraction in general is often promoted as kind of, this is the way to create jobs. This is kind of the only possibility we have if we want to have jobs, and also why they in the end get quite a lot of support from the local communities, probably more of the support from local elites, local politicians, trade union leaders, than people on the ground who are quite aware, I think, often of the consequences of having a petrochemical plant or a coal mine in their backyard. But often seen as kind of, there is no alternative line of reasoning saying we need to have this, we need to have petrochemicals, either because that's what we need to have to develop, or because all the riches or the level of development we have achieved within the last 100 to 50 years. That goes for a lot of the Middle Eastern and North African countries, is dependent on fossil fuels. So we don't really have much of an alternative. If the rest of the world is going to consume less fossil gas, less oil, we need to branch out into something else, such as petrochemicals. So I think that's a key kind of component. And then it's often quite integrated. That's one thing that struck me from working on this is how integrated the petrochemical infrastructure often is with the state, and how far back this goes to time before the Second World War, something I was not aware of at all. How often they have been partly state-owned. I learned most of that from you, actually, Frederick, and how it's been tied to kind of state industrial policy in a way that you also find with fossil fuels, or with the military in general. So there are some pretty fundamental power structures within these societies that means that it's difficult to convince people that there is an alternative that doesn't involve fossil fuels on some level, especially not people as a population in general, but especially those who have more influence, more power within these societies.
Thank you. If we have questions to the panel, then please wave, and also online, please pose questions to the panel in the Q&A box. But let's start from the back. Carl?
Yes, following up on your point, Jacob, I was thinking, like, given the strong interlinkage between states in the petrochemical sector, are we seeing some sort of form of transition where the new rentier state sector becoming petrochemicals? It's a form of providing rent for the population to not demand democratization of society, etc. And how does then that the form of let's say dictatorship, democracy system has an impact on this? Like, I mean, do we end up in a debate around, like, how do we empower people? Yeah. I don't know if that's also a formulation, but yeah.
Let's take 3 questions or so. Who else waved? You're too hesitant, so Caroline.
Yeah, I was just linking your discussion here with the presentation from Jonathan earlier. And the thing that struck me with his presentation was, whilst he was talking about the need to constrain demand for the petrochemical sector in various ways, he was also, to me, making this case, well, there's going to be a need to expand it, especially for the ammonia side, which to me I just found entirely depressing. And I was kind of like, okay, something's wrong with this picture. So I'm just trying to think now to come, and I know much more about the plastic side than these other petrochemicals. But in the plastic side, one of the things that we talk about is, you know, the plastics treaty is not going to get rid of all plastic, right? There will still be plastic. There are still needs for plastic, certain kinds of plastic. So the question is, when do we have enough capacity for the things that are necessary, you know, quote unquote necessary? And so I'm just wondering here, I guess I'm just thinking to myself that it will be useful to think, okay, if we have X amount of capacity now until 2030 for petrochemicals production, can we divide out what we have now in a way that we reduce production of some things? And if we need more ammonia, then, well, let's reduce the plastic side and produce ammonia. He sort of said, well, everything that's in construction now, it's too late to stop it. So basically we're stuck with whatever is expanding until 2030. Anyway, so I guess my question with me is, there another, do we risk, can we find a better way of using what we already have and decarbonizing it? I haven't heard a lot of people today talk about shutting down what is already there. There's sort of this implicit sense that we're keeping what we have. So I guess that's my question of you. Are we keeping what we have and just stopping expanding it? And can we justify this discourse around no more expansion Because to me, that's what in the plastics world, we're talking about no more expansion of capacity, full stop. We're probably not even using fully the production capacity that we have. But does that work for the industry more broadly? Sorry, that was a long question, Frederick. Thinking out loud too much.
All right, one more question. You want?
Delphine, a question to you. So, like you mentioned, there are lots of protests all around the world, all around the globe, but they tend to be dispersed and tend to be directed towards local environmental effects. So, do you see any hope there of building up pressure from below, linking these protests? And yeah, I'm interested in your thinking about it.
Okay, so is petrochemicals the new sort of rentier state sector of preference? And is there sort of democracy effect on sort of the interest in making it so? What is actual demand in a way? Can we actually argue for a production cap, and on what level could we set that? Is that current levels? Is it below? So we have to talk about phasing out. Is it acknowledging some new growth? And is there a hope that sort of local groups can support each other globally to become stronger and more visible? But let's start with Jakob. Is this the new rentier state sector of preference?
I think more kind of in future implementation. I'm not super familiar with that, how expand this or right now, but I think some rentier states are thinking petrochemicals as a new kind of outlet, especially like Saudi Arabia with this, it's Saudi Aramco's purchase of SABIC, one of the world's largest petrochemical producers. So in that sense, I think countries such as Saudi Arabia, it is seen as kind of way of future-proofing the regime, laminating it in plastic, so to speak, to maintain it for the future. Whether it will work or not will probably also depend on not just that, but also on what happens to future demand, and ideas about curbing future demand, stopping no new plants, as Caroline brought up.
Sridharbesh, you have explicitly called for a sort of production cap in a paper that was published in Science 2 years ago or so. So how do we think about what such a cap would, what would it be? What would it do? And how do we think about sort of, what would it look like? And how do we think about global equity? I mean, we know that there's a sort of 10 times difference in the consumption of plastic specifically between all parts of sub-Saharan Africa and the US. It's an order of magnitude almost, right? So what would a production cap look like? Is it reasonable?
Your report is so essential for us to think about what might a production cap look like. The way I see it, the petrochemical industry has spread its eggs across multiple baskets, multiple chemical baskets, right? So one of the, and then it is carrying out a carbon optimization across sectors, if that makes sense. So if we are getting rid of fossil plastics, which of course involves a lot of carbon emission in petrochemical refining, right? Like I'm referring to the visual from your report, which actually shows the process side of greenhouse gas emissions, petrochemicals significantly higher. So we are thinking about needs. We are thinking about differential needs across region, across socioeconomic classes, right? We're thinking about needs across different kind of political regimes and their priorities. Does that mean we are using more petrochemicals, say, to make bioplastic, so to speak, just to reduce fossil plastics and the emissions at the refining level? Would that mean investing in more bioplastics production, so to speak, or like making plastics, hydrocarbons still, from bio-based sources, but what kind of land relations, land ownership relations, forest right relations would that entail? At the same time, what kind of chemicals would be used, petrochemicals included, would be used to make these bioplastics malleable and responding to the needs in other ways, needs of products in other ways, right? So one of the ways in which we formulate the production cap is in a more aggregated sense at the planetary scale, because it is exceeding any capacity for communities across countries to manage this safely or efficiently. This is not a technological possibility. Jonathan mentioned entropy, thermodynamics. It's just not physically possible. You cannot destroy matter, for example. Right? But at the same time, we're also thinking about justice, but we are very conscious about needs of society's essential users, so to speak. So it's also the production cap is a positive constraint for industries to think about, not just in terms of use, commerce, but also in terms of social and environmental justice. So this will necessarily involve politicians, it will involve industry across the regions, across the petrochemical and production industry, which necessarily involves multiple actors, multiple sources of funds, multiple capital shares in their specific markets and such. How does it look like? It looks complex. There is a lot of tension. There is a lot of differences and divides and inequalities. But we do need to reduce the aggregate amount of novel entities and plastics that are in circulation in the world.
Thank you. Delphine, is there a hope that we can build a network of local groups that they become stronger together? And let me throw in another thing, as you highlight a bunch of what are basically sort of structural human rights abuse connected to the fuel industry and also to the petrochemicals industry. Are there other ways of getting like UN institutions, rapporteurs on human rights and the Secretary General and other sort of prominent figures to support these groups and sort of name and shame companies and countries that are, where this is happening? And has there been attempts to sort of connect with these global institutions, the UN, connect the sort of local movements to these global institutions?
I want to answer the whole three questions in yours at the same time. Yeah, so one thing we've been doing, and we're sort of anticipating on the next panel, is really to support environmental justice advocates who are on the front line of the petrochemicals build out to participate in the plastics treaty negotiations. And it has been a real intentional effort to bring these people, and I don't want to say these voices because they're not just voices, they're not just stories, they're like experts. They know more than you and I about how petrochemicals are being made and what are the impacts on environment and people. And we have organized meetings with them and key delegations. But still the way the process is working is actively excluding people like them. And we'll probably go back to that in the second panel. And yeah, UN reports and everything, great. And I work for the Center for International Environmental Law, so I'm not going to say anything bad against all these institutions. They help exposing the problem, but the roots are so deep, and especially it's coming back to the first question about the link with the authoritarian regimes and also how it's working in terms of transparency, security of activism. That goes back to your question. There is always hope, but on the way, people will die. There is hope of mobilization, but people in many countries know that they will mobilize against something, against a project, and that they may die, or that the people they love may die. Because that's how it works in those places. And we're extremely privileged in the global north even though my country, France, is becoming a lot less good when it comes to enforcement of rule of law. But we're extremely privileged to be able to protest. And most of the people on the ground are not protesting the way you and I think about protest. They're protesting in very different ways. It's connecting to also, you know, the discussion around how it's that bringing sort of jobs to these people, and how much in the context of talking about a just transition, which is a word that we haven't talked about much yet, how are we providing or looking at the system in a different way? And I want to name that as an NGO, we're not here just to talk about people and human rights and mobilization on the ground. We're also here to talk about system change and the complexity, and your question about the capacities we currently have. I mean, my answer to that is, first, we don't really know what we have. And to know that, we have to pay a lot of money to very expensive databases. So to be able to answer properly a question about how changing the system looks like, we first need to have full transparency. That goes with mandatory monitoring and reporting. That goes with very strict demands from governments in terms of what are you producing? Where are you producing it? What's the input? What's the output? And then you need to also realize that even what we have today is problematic. It's not only about the build out, it's about how plants currently operate. And the question about what's necessary or not is also about not falling in this easy trap of substitution. Ammonia for shipping is not going to solve our problem. It's highly corrosive. It may explode. You're going to have lots of ship going around with tanks full of ammonia. This is not going to solve anything. It can solve it from one end of the snake, but on the other one, it's still going to bite. So it's important to stop thinking that there is just an easy replacement of certain substances and even sources of energy. Hydrogen. You need a lot of water to produce green hydrogen. And you also need a lot of renewable energy, so potentially sun. Places that have a lot of land and a lot of sun usually don't have a lot of water. So you're taking the water from the people, which is already happening in Texas, in Louisiana. They're taking the water, the clean water, for petrochemicals facilities and hydrogen production. So it's really, my friend who's not here, I know Aitomaki, she said something 7 years ago that sticks in my mind still. She said there is no sustainable product, there are only sustainable systems. And the conversation we need to have is about rethinking the system, but not only just, okay, so plastic, no, it's really an entire conversation which requires to deal with complexity, and human brains hate complexity. They just hate that because it's not commercializable. You can't just say, hey, we're going to deal with complexity. No, it's just oh, this is a problem. Here is your solution. The solution is not simple. That's why we need to have an actual conversation. And it starts by having data on which we can base tangible, concrete, reasonable scenarios to change what's going on right now.
All right, so I hope that we've been trying to think about complexity today, even though our brains hate it. Thank you. Time runs very quickly, so we have to end this panel here. We'll take a 5-minute short break before we're moving into the next panel session. Thank you so much, panelists, for your insights today. All right. We have the next panel on the stage, and we're moving into the final session of today's event. And I'm very excited to say welcome to the next group of panelists. We have from the far end, Carolyn Deer-Bergback, who was on the team and who has more affiliations than I can even remember, but you're with the Geneva Graduate Institute, the director for the TESS Forum on Trade and Environment and Sustainability, Chatham House, University of Oxford, probably forgot a few. We have Tobias Nielsen, who is currently with the European Environment Agency, working on circular economy and plastics. And we have Bethany Carney-Almroth, who's a professor of ecotoxicology at the University of Gothenburg, and also on the steering group for the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, trying to promote or support the Global Plastics Treaty process with science-based evidence. So very glad to have you all here to talk about the Global Plastics Treaty and the need to reform international governance in the realm of petrochemicals. And so I'm going to start with giving you the opportunity to give us your most important insights into this topic in sort of 3 minutes, and then we'll move into a discussion. So Bethany, please, would you like to start? What do we have to do to reform international governance in this domain?
Big question, yeah?
It is, yeah, 3 minutes.
Before coming here, I was given the task of reflecting also on your report and maybe something positive about the report and what I think is important. And since we're talking about the treaty in this panel, I think I will also talk about chapter 4 in here about the narrative. So as Trita mentioned before, we've been calling for a cap on plastics production, and a lot of the other speakers have touched on this question. The report does a really good job of explaining why that's going to be hard, sort of mapping out all of the obstacles that are in place there. But I'm a natural scientist, I'm an ecotoxicologist, and I work with environmental impacts. And I've also been working with the planetary boundaries framework. And we put a lot of time into understanding like the biogeophysical impacts of plastics and chemicals. And we see clearly that it's too much already. It's too much. We've moved beyond the safe operating space for humanity to a point where we can be destabilizing the planet and changing its functions and thereby changing the very characteristics of the planet that are conducive for humans as a species to survive. So based on those indications, we most definitely need to see a cap on plastics production. And we also need to see changes in the way that we're using chemicals. So the word chemicals has come up a lot today. And just to have it said in this room, some new reports came out in the past 2 weeks from UNEP, ERS, FAO, looking at chemicals in plastics. And that number right now is put at about 13,000. Just a year or two ago, we thought it was 10,000. I'm sure we're going to discover more. And the reason why I say we're going to discover more is because there's no transparency around this. There's no requirements for producers to tell us what they're putting into products. And this also speaks to the fact that consumers are not asking for these things. Consumers are not asking for products that contain toxic chemicals. We already know right now that 3,200 of the chemicals used in plastics have hazardous properties, and there are even more that we have no data on at all. So if I have to put this into context, there are about 350,000 chemicals that are registered for production on the global market, and we have good toxicity data maybe on 8,000 of those. And all of the best agencies in the world working on understanding chemical toxicity can properly assess maybe 10 or 12 chemicals a year. So the way we're doing things right now is absolutely unsustainable. And this is one of the things that we're going to be pushing for in the treaty negotiations, that we need to see a reduction in production. We need to see a simplification of the market so it becomes manageable, so we can understand the impacts that it's having on the environment, on human health. And one of the things that you touch on very nicely in this report is in chapter 4 on the narrative. And there you quite nicely give examples of how the petrochemical industry, the fossil fuel industry, and plastic producers are using like the big tobacco playbook to delay, to muddy the waters, to create doubt, to create a space in which they can continue producing or even increase their productions while the rest of us try to figure out what's going on. Like, do we really need this? Is it really good for us? Maybe do we know enough? Can we act yet? We're not sure. It's a very well-proven methodology for delaying action. It's been going on for decades. Even the part about consumers wanting these things, asking for these products, or placing individual blame on people for littering, for not properly taking care of the goods, making bad choices from start to finish. The 1970s, I think it was 1970s campaign from the United States with the crying Indian, saying like already there, they were shifting focus away from the producers to the individuals. And so that's one of the things I would like to lift. This is something that at least the scientists going to the meeting need to be very aware of, so they can try to counteract these narratives when necessary and deliver the real science and facts to the negotiators in that space.
Thank you. Tobias, you're working for an institution that is part of the, or closely connected to the European Union and the European Commission. So what can sort of the EU do? What are you doing? What can you do? And what do you see need to happen? International governance.
3 minutes.
All right, no problem. Yeah, thanks for that. No, and yes, and also this is exactly where my mind is at the moment. So yeah, shifting us down to the EU level. Yeah. So one thing I noticed from this, this silver lining ground is this awareness, and I think that's one of the key things that first steps that have to happen is this linkage between plastics, petrochemicals, climate, and also other sustainable or environmental issues. And I think, in my work, I meet this all the time. We still have to remind people, the plastic challenges doesn't end or doesn't start just at the plastic product. There's a whole sort of industry behind it, which we also need to look at, which we need to connect to. Just the other day, or just actually today, I was reading a report that's coming out, and on sort of how can we decarbonize industry in general, and then they looked at ethylene, and some of the key actions were to increase the recyclable or use recycled materials in plastic bottles. It was to reduce the plastic packaging of supermarkets. And for me, these are very small, and these were some of the key outcomes. And this will help us decarbonize the European industry. And I was like, oh, okay, this is for me very tangible, very small steps, and it doesn't sort of oversees the whole business behind it. If we sort of reduce demand for in some areas of plastics, I'm sure that it will rebound and come up in other areas. So we really need to sort of, if we want to reduce, we need to sort of put in policies in place at the very beginning of the life cycle. And the other thing I thought about is disclosure. So, show us your numbers. So we have a chapter, or there's a chapter on the webs of finance, and we can turn that into the whips of finance. So there's a lot of discussions around sustainable finance on the EU level. We have the taxonomy for sustainable finance, and although it's riddled with problems and it's losing its legitimacy, there's still something to talk about it. So it is trying to, for investors, show what is a substantial contribution, for example, on plastic packaging, and also where are the areas where it should do no harm. So that's in a way that the good thing with that is that it's trying to connect all the different areas of not just climate, but also biodiversity and also just transition and other areas. Whether it's delivering on that, you could question that, but at least there's a framework. I think these types of frameworks that really connect the different areas is something that should be encouraged more. And also, I think again on sustainable finance, these initiatives, the taxonomy, the science-based targets initiatives, the corporate sustainable disclosure, and so on. There's a whole range of them coming up, and we can see that this is influencing a range of different industries that now feel a bit of pressure that they have to deliver some of the numbers. So I remember when this project started, we were concerned that the petrochemicals is sort of flying under the radar. And these are some of the things, this demand from investors to see what are you doing on sustainability, what is your impact on sustainability? These types of initiatives, can help. It will take time, and it's still full of, or there's a room for improvement. Health, we talked a lot about health, and I think health is another issue that's really coming in a lot. We saw it with PFAS just recently in the media in Denmark, but also on the EU level. There's now a very strong movement. A lot of member states are moving towards banning PFAS in everything except where it cannot be substituted. And that's there's textiles. It's a lot of plastic products as well. So I think that health dimension is also getting policymakers' minds around the huge risk there is with plastics. So there's a lot of toxic chemicals in plastics. There's also
and whole industry feeding a lot of these toxic chemicals, which needs to be looked into, which needs to be regulated. So I think that health dimension is one of the policy hooks or areas that really, I think, could matter a lot.
We'll get to talk more later. Moving on in the sort of introductory section, Carolyn, you already said something about the sort of fragmented nature of governance in this domain. Tobias just raised health and finance. Finance was on your radar, but health was not really. But what do you see sort of from your work in Geneva, closely collaborating with many of these secretariats belonging to different UN organizations?
I think, it's a good point that you raise it in the report. We didn't look at health governance, but I would also say it's really only been in the last 3 or 4 months at the international level that there's been that strengthened interest in how to engage the health system in responding to plastic pollution. I mean, it's been there. Obviously, it's been a huge concern for a long time, and people have been trying to get that issue up. Groups like CL wrote a report on health and plastics 2 or 3 years ago, but I know this week at the World Health Assembly, there's some countries are pushing for a resolution for further work at WHO on chemicals, but specifically on plastics, to try and bring that expertise from the health community and sort of put it on the health governance agenda as well, which is interesting, which I don't think that would be the first resolution or the first specific mandate the WHO has got from governments to be working on health, if indeed that goes forward. I'm sorry, to be working on plastics and to sort of bring them into the plastics treaty process. Yeah, that in a sense is something we probably should have made more of in the report, but I think that's also very specific. It's quite recent. The things that I had planned to say was firstly to emphasize just this point that I think that the other speakers have made, that I think the health dimension will be central in Paris next week at the treaty discussions. Having worked closely with a number of governments, I think they really frame this as both an environment issue and a health issue, as 2 parallel tracks, which is a huge shift to 6 months or even a year ago as a core part of the treaty, and that part of its role should be protecting human health. So it's a massive transition, and I think it affects the way that one needs to argue for action as well. So beforehand, a lot of it might have been on the climate footprint of the plastic sector or the biodiversity impacts and so on, but it's also about sort of fundamental health impacts, both of the products themselves, but also of the production processes. And that gets you looking at, I think, as our colleague mentioned before, both at the expansion, but also at how we can fix what's already being produced, or how and whether we can fix what already is being produced. But just in terms of Paris and on the petrochemical sector and governance, I do think, as I mentioned this morning, that the treaty has the ability to help us do 3 things that will help with petrochemical governance more broadly. It will provide, hopefully, strong commitments for reduction of the overall scale of plastics production. Now, we don't know whether it will be reduction from current levels or a reduction in the sense of stopping expansion, or it will be a standstill. All of that will have to be negotiated. But I think the idea that we don't need more is something that is in the mind of many negotiators, and that we don't want to have, we can't solve this problem while allowing for there to be more, I think is something that people have understood. The second thing is, I do think we'll see pressure to eliminate and restrict a number of specific polymers as part, but that's a separate issue to the overall idea of overall reduction, is the idea that there should be some specific restrictions. And I also think that we will see discussion of boosting transparency of volumes of production and the material composition of products that are on the market, and not just the volume of primary plastics, but also of chemicals associated with plastics production. I think that's really key. It's very hard to regulate something if you don't know how much is being produced and where and by whom. So that's, and the only other thing I was saying is there's some countries that are interested in this idea of whether the treaty can say something about investment that supports ending plastic pollution and the transformation of the sector. And part of that, I think, will be whether or not it can hint in the direction of countries should be requiring corporate disclosure as well as part of their efforts.
All right, thank you. So lots of things already, right? And we're going to talk more about the sort of attempts at the global level and the plastics treaty. But first, Tobias, are there also sort of opportunities for initiatives and interventions at different levels of governance? So what do we know? Are there sort of strong opportunities or strong initiatives pushing, for example, at regional or even local and municipal level? We have a question online sort of pointing to that they're seeing big differences in like municipal policies and trying to sort of address this domain. What are we seeing in the EU and beyond on sort of more local levels of governance?
I think definitely in some countries, it's cities are very involved, and also local municipals are the ones that are really pushing the agenda on more and more ambitious levels or actions on plastics. And I think that's something that we're seeing across a lot of different countries. I think on the EU level, it's there's a lot of initiatives when it comes to circular plastics, so that are coming in or sort of or being discussed at the moment. There's been a lot of discussions around microplastics, also tying very much the health dimension into this and how we can sort of reduce this sustainable products. So also disclosing what are the impacts of these products, not just on climate, but also on a range of different environmental areas. And then I think that for me now, working closely with the Commission, it's interesting what's going to happen next. So the Commission is sort of rounding up its current program, and there'll be European Parliament elections. There'll also be a new Commission soon, and sort of the new plastics, strategy. If there's one coming, what would that? So we had one before in 18, I think. What would be the new sort of direction? Because I think there's a lot of areas that are still left untouched.
And so sort of taking us back to the global treaty negotiations, there's been lots of talk or lots of mentioning of the need for better transparency, better sort of understanding what's going on. So Bethany, from a sort of natural science perspective, what is it that you would be sort of asking for in the treaty negotiations, in the treaty, to, in terms of mandating transparency? What types of data is it that you think we need to better understand the implications and effects on the environment and human health, as we say, that is becoming a sort of central part of this treaty? And then, Carolyn, what do we know sort of from previous conventions and treaties about sort of the success of mandating transparency reporting? I mean, we have some of that in the BRS conventions, right? But Bethany, you first.
Yeah, so first, just touching back on the industry narrative, in a private conversation with industry representatives, I've been told that they don't want a treaty, obviously, but they also see that we need to drastically increase plastics production to meet our climate goals, which is obviously looking at one of the many problems we're facing on the planet today. But when it comes to transparency, they also see that they don't want to do this, it's not possible to do this, and they are legally protected in not doing this. Which is why, as has already been mentioned, we'll need to see changes in legal frameworks and requirements around corporate disclosure on their chemicals. But as I said, there's many, many chemicals and plastics. And right now, when we're talking about circularity, if we're going to just look at something that has been proposed as sustainable, recycling comes up quite a lot. It's not working to date. The numbers are somewhere between 5 and 9% of plastics are recycled. And that which is being done is not being done safely, very much because of the chemicals. Also because of the products on the market that are very complex. So they're multi-layered, lots of different materials. But the chemicals themselves are making recycling dangerous and also insufficient. So there's a decrease in product quality and material quality. But the numbers of chemicals that we're finding in recycled plastics is astronomical, and they're toxic. And we have no idea where these chemicals are going, where they're coming from. So what I would really like to see is chemical transparency, which I think could help support a simplification of the market, fewer polymers and fewer chemicals. So creating positive lists and negative lists where we can most definitely say like these chemicals are not allowed. And the recent reports that came out show that currently only 1% of chemicals and plastics are regulated internationally. So it's a very small number. But to increase that negative list, things we have to get off the market, and also maybe a positive list. If we can all agree, like, we'll just use these materials and these few safe chemicals, we can simplify the market and maybe increase circularity, increase reuse systems, and potentially, if it's possible, technologically, maybe a lot of qualifiers here, recycling. This reliance on techno fixes that you also bring up in your report is something we need to be wary of. Chemical recycling has been put forth both by the industry, but also by UNEP and some of their documents as one of the solutions. And this is a solution that is not scalable or safe or viable, both in terms of greenhouse gas output, energy use, and toxic chemicals. And the chemicals are always coming in as a problem. So this is one of my biggest wish lists is transparency and a simplification of the market.
And are there sort of particular types of data and information that you would prioritize to see being mandated?
Like very high level, just production volumes, which polymers are being produced in which volumes and where. And then in terms of chemicals that are going in, we have both the additives, but also the NIASs, which are much harder, I understand, to get a control on. Right. NIAS is non-intentionally added substances. So these are byproducts, degradation products, contaminations. I understand that's a much more difficult ask, but if they can just tell us what they're putting in there to start with, which chemicals and how many of them, and which products are they going into? Because we don't have that information. Right now, we're constantly working backwards. I'm working with analytical chemists to do analyses of products to try to figure out what's in there. And it's extremely costly and time consuming. But the industry, at least in each step of the way, knows what they've added. There are a lot of actors in the value chain of these materials. So we don't have a complete picture of what's in the product once it's in our hands. And that means that we don't know if they're safe. And most of the time we know that they're not safe.
All right, Carolyn, so what do we know about sort of mandates for reporting and disclosure internationally from previous conventions and international policies?
And so I think across global governance, we can say that there's a mixed success with governments complying with their reporting requirements. So you probably find a region like the EU has relatively high compliance. You take transparency and notification requirements quite seriously. Other countries may find it extremely difficult, even if they want to administratively, to provide that information. Many countries just don't keep good national statistics on any range of things. It's hugely expensive. It requires an effective bureaucracy to gather these statistics from parts of your industry. And I also think that then you have countries that don't have an interest in complying, right? And don't want to meet their obligations to report, whether that's on, we see that in the climate regime, we see that around certain chemicals, around all kinds of things. Countries see it also around trade notifications. Countries don't want you to know exactly what's happening inside their borders. But I also think countries have different national ways of getting data from companies. As Bethany said, in some instances, it's difficult to force your countries to disclose. I mean, I know in the area of plastics production, we probably all here face this challenge of trying to acquire data, and then you have to pay for access to huge costs to pay access to databases. And then when they find out that you're a researcher, and I guess they Google you and find out what your background is, they don't want to give you access to their data anyway. So I think that's really challenging. And I think one of these is the big issues around production capacity is we know we have some estimates of what capacity is. We don't necessarily know what the actual production is and what share of the actual capacity is. I mean, same with waste management capacity. We actually don't know in many countries around the world what the capacity is. And so therefore it's hard to say how much plastic production or waste that country can bear if you don't have this data. So for me, that's really important. But I do think here, but I mean, obviously we need it as a first step. We need to put pressure on the fact that countries should report. I think alongside government pressure, what one can do is have pressure from the finance sector to disclose as a condition for investment, which is one key way you can shift. In the US context, I know there are many more requirements on companies to report on different environmental indicators as part of their fiduciary responsibilities, which is a way that makes it a lot tougher because that's enforced. But the other part besides the finance sector, which I think can help, is the role of scientists and independent monitoring. Now, it's difficult to get all of the data, but I think that historically it's been the accountability function of the scientific community, at least if it's on particular sectors or products. You know, you can't cover it all, but there are things we're going to be able to cover that are going to be a great way of forcing some public transparency and shining light on what is hidden. And I think that one thing I always feel is a shame in global governance is we consistently take for granted the work of civil society organizations and especially local organizations in gathering this information. And I think this is particularly important around health impacts. There was recently the Minderoo Commission report on health and plastic pollution, and just, you know, staggering evidence about the impacts of the plastic sector and the production process itself, extraction process, on human health, and especially on children. And the thing that I found incredibly moving was the guy from the US who was the lead scientist behind it, talking about the impact that plastics and chemicals have on, I think it was the first 300 days of life, which says there's this exquisite moment where our brains are so incredibly delicate and our bodies are so incredibly delicate. So what we as an adult can bear is so different to what children can bear. And the evidence was really overwhelming. But I think there it relies on people like him getting funding, but also, as he was saying, people from local communities having the funding and the access to resources and to publicize and get attention to these issues. There's something in the global governance scene that we kind of take for granted that people are doing that work. And it's generally underfunded, underpaid, and and underappreciated. So I think that's something that, as part of our global governance story, we need to make sure there are resources for, if we want to have transparency around these things as well.
All right, thank you. So a question from online listener. So we've already alluded to sort of the lobbying efforts of the industry and its work in sort of promoting particular types of narratives. So what are we expecting from the industry to push in terms of narratives to mitigate, if not annihilate the content of the Global Plastics Treaty? You know, basically play down the treaty process and make sure that it doesn't threaten them, because, as you say, informally, we've heard that they're not very fond of it, and well, it's really quite we've also seen it reported in major outlets. So what are we expecting there, and how do we mitigate it? Are we already seeing it in, for example, the EU? Who would like to go first? Perhaps, and then Tobias.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I've already alluded to some of this, but some of their arguments are that we need plastics to reach our climate goals, that plastics are the most sustainable material and they are what will move us into a sustainable lifestyle going forward. And then when they do need to reduce or move into circularity, techno solutions that are unproven. We already talked about carbon capture systems this morning or earlier today, and chemical recycling are put forth as solutions that are not viable, not scalable, and not safe. So I think those will be on the table, and perhaps not in plenary, but in smaller conversations. I think economic interest must definitely come into play, as your report very well indicates. So these are, I think, the major talking points that we'll be hearing. And the fact that it's not possible to work with transparency, it's too difficult, they're protected by legal frameworks and so on. That's some of what I'm expecting.
Have we seen some of this already in the EU? There's been lots of work on plastics, which to a large degree is textiles, and lots of chemicals, for example. Is there anything that we can have seen there that we can sort of
I think
expect more of?
The report does a good job of sort of capturing some of the key narratives that are visible in the EU as well. Sort of, you know, we're well on the way. You know, it's these niche technologies. We just need to scale them up, and you need plastics for a stable transition. I think those are by and large, a lot of the narratives that we see there as well. And I think what we need is also sort of to split the industry. So just to be, we also need it. You know, we need the industry on our side as well. So we need to, in textiles, there is a from what I hear from my colleagues, there is sort of a coalition of more ambitious textile producers they want to sort of, they demand more regulation, they demand more sort of, well, how can we transition? And so we need to also cater for this, allow, not just that Plastic Europe or other sort of similar associations represent the whole industry, but see where are the ones that are trying to do something, and can we sort of promote that in a way and allow their voices also to sort of influence the debate and not treat them as a one industry that's all in it, that are just the baddies, but they're try to differentiate them a bit as well.
Differentiating between producers and manufacturers as well, I think, and where they are in this life stage of plastics.
Yeah. All right, let's take a round of questions and then let's wrap up. So, Jonathan?
I was just interested in the comments on kind of transparency of data, because that's products to materials is about 90% of what I do, is trying to map them. And we're currently got the top 1,000 products with the plastics going into them mapped. But we're really interested in, no one's mentioned the kind of product passport type legislation that's coming through, if it gets done, and to make it mandatory that you have to report. And medical industry already does this, but it's not open. But making companies report what's in their products and their origin. Are we going to get anywhere with it?
Sorry, can you speak up a bit? Yeah. Were you done?
Yeah. I heard you.
Passports.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a question about the idea of cap on plastic production. How would that be measured? Because Kyoto Protocol style, there was a metric was tons of CO2, because most emissions were CO2, and others could be somehow converted into CO2, equivalent of CO2. Biodiversity, there's no biodiversity metric, but they agreed, there was agreement on having 30% of terrestrial land, 30% of marine surface being set off and being protected, because that would increase biodiversity. How would you actually measure where you were in terms of plastic cap? Would it be tons of plastic, even though plastic is quite diverse, both in terms of its polluting effects and its uses, or would it be some more kind of sophisticated, fine-grained material way of doing that?
I don't know, but start.
Final
one more
question. Yeah, Sophie.
I have two. One is for Tobias. Yeah, I'll try to. So you just mentioned one of my favorite words, Plastics Europe, and I just wanted to know if you also hear the same thing that I hear and what you think about it. On one hand, we have the fossil fuel industry, especially in Europe, saying that plastic is their future, like Total Energy and others. And then on the other hand, we have Plastics Europe saying that by 2050, they will be fossil fuel free. So there seems to be a little discrepancy between the two. So your thoughts about that? And Bethany, on how much we are able to access and monitor the negotiations and the influence of the fossil fuel lobbyists in the plastic treaty negotiations with what's happening right now, and if you can share with folks who don't know what's happening right now.
All right. So product passports. I think that one.
Yeah, I can give it a go. Yeah. So we have products passports. We asked if this data would be available for us as an EU agency, and it's not. Yeah.
So probably not for me.
Yeah.
Probably not for me either.
We're hoping that this would be like a really good data source, and to monitor all kinds of things we can monitor. And what we heard now is that because of privacy issues, it's not going to be available even for us. Yeah. So unfortunately, but there might be some. We're hoping some of the other instruments on corporate social disclosure might be available. There might be some more information there, but there you would have to, look at each companies and their reporting. So it would have to be sort of a big task in gathering all that information. But luckily we have AI is technically, so maybe something there. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
How do we quantify production? What's a sort of useful manner? What's a manageable manner of doing it?
All of the data thus far has been in mass, as you already alluded to. But if we can sort of break that down into monomers, polymers, and then the chemicals that are included there. I think mass is the easiest way to go right now. And then, yeah, hopefully more detailed information. Right now, like Plastics Europe is one of the best open sources we have of production, which says something, right? That in and of itself about what the production volumes look like for the high production polymers.
Can I just add on to that point that my understanding is that for those governments, I mean, it's no done deal that there will be any provisions in the treaty on reduction overall or elimination even of particular products and chemicals, but one can hope. You know, I think there'll be a strong push for that. But I do think in that regard, for those of you who have researched and also like looking over here at Jonathan, that I know there's a huge demand from countries at some point. If there's a provision, it will say we are going to reduce these to an agreed level. There'll be some kind of baseline. It'll be this year, last year, if, you know, they have to make up a baseline, or they have to make up a volume. And at some point that has to have some correlation to reality. And I don't think that people really have it, because we kind of all look around at each other and go, have you got the data? I got the data. Someone, you know, the OECD says, you know, has some numbers, but I'm not really sure that it's clear. So to my mind, a key piece of information we need is what is current production capacity, right?
ICIS is the data, obviously.
Who does, sorry?
ICIS is the data.
ICIS. Oh, you have the data.
Okay,
exactly.
You will, but they have the data, so that's where you want to put the pressure on.
See, they won't sell it even to people like me.
They sell it to them.
They sell it to you, so that's fine. Anyway,
You're getting around it by converting it all into emissions.
okay, but just to say that I think for negotiate, it's a key thing, because when I brought this up with many delegations, they say, well, don't we need, you know, that could take us years to get the number. I'm like, no, I'm sure in 6 months we can get you a number on a table that says that. So if that's, I mean, that's a good piece of information already, even for next week, that we make that seem possible, that it's possible to get production data that have some bearing on reality. And just to say to your point, my understanding is there's two different issues which need two different arguments. One is this idea that there's just too much plastic of whatever type in the world being produced, and we certainly don't want more of it. A second thing is there might be particular polymers that are particularly bad for either certain health or environmental reasons, or because of, you know, they're problematic for circularity or something like that. But they're two different, there'll be two different parts of the treaty that deal with that. So the elimination is just like, we don't like it under any circumstances anywhere. And other things like, well, it's just a reduction of the overall volume. And here one needs to think, I think, harder than we have been so far about really what the arguments are. Is it because of carbon impacts, or is it because you can't put more into the system if you can't recycle it? You know, you can't make anything else in the system work, secondary material market, circularity work. Because what might happen is companies will come back and say, well, actually PET is fine, so let's keep PET constant or growing and just reduce other types to reach the overall cap. So I don't think we've done that much thinking about what the overall cap is. It for equally applied to all kinds of polymers, or are we reducing the total number and then phasing some out? If we get some elimination and we get some more circularity, will that do enough? Anyway, that's just thinking out loud, but that's something that I don't feel like governments have heard clear enough messages about yet. I don't know if that answer, it doesn't really answer your question, but to say I don't think there is a clear answer yet. Yeah.
Yes. There was a question from the right.
Well, on Plastic Europe.
Okay. I have some thoughts there too.
Yeah, interesting actor. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's interesting so far. We talked about data, that they have been so pivotal in sort of supplying the data. Everybody's using their data. So I think as a sort of a part of a regulatory machine, we really want other data as well. So we can, and we're trying to build sort of some kind of indicator set to say what's happening on plastics. In the lack of sort of raw data, we're just trying to see, are there any kind of signals or data so we can sort of harvest information from and see what are the trends to say something about circular economy or circular plastics and where we're heading, which is sort of an additional sort of which can tell a different story than the one story we've been fed so far. And just on what they're promising, yeah, well, I think we all know what.
Can I just
well, I mean, what we think about that, yeah. I'm not really sure that they're going to comply with that fully. Yeah.
Can I just add something really fast, just on this issue of not only does one need to know what the current production capacity is, but then you need some way of thinking about what is an agreed level, you know, or what is a sustainable level. And at some point, there's going to be an empirical scientific aspect to that. And then there'll just be a political kind of like, well, whatever, they'll just decide it's 2020 levels or 2025 levels or 2030 levels. It won't necessarily be that scientific.
Political decision.
But I do think
scientific decision.
it would be useful to have some scientific input into it to say, well, this level, actually, if we upped our recycling, we eliminated 50 key uses that are unnecessary, took out the harmful stuff, then actually today's capacity is okay. We can do what we need to do, and that might provide some of that industry some comfort that we're not taking every piece of plastic out of the global market. And that's when I've spoken to some governments, they've said, well, it's not a no plastic on the market proposition. It's a 300 million tons a year for these purposes that we can say might be useful for the green transition or for health and safety, whatever it is. But the rest of it, we say, actually, we can do it with that much capacity.
On monitoring, I mean, I think most of we need different voices on that. So we have an event, or the EA has an event in Paris next week on sort of on that issue on, how can we monitor for this? We need to know what are the baselines, and so we know what the effects of this treaty will be. Right now, it's anybody's guess.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all based on models or some. So I think many of us could sort of rally that cause and say we agree to that. We really need some numbers on the table.
Yeah.
So regarding the comments about fossil fuel versus carbon capture, I think the industry has been lobbying the Global South, for example, to roll back some legislation to increase plastics production, use, and sales on those markets. So I think they're looking south while standing up here in Europe and saying, we're going to use carbon capture to make all our plastics, no more fossil fuels. So they might be doing both. They might be with one hand doing this over here and with the other hand doing this over here. I think that's probably one of their strategies. And to be honest, I don't understand how they're going to use carbon capture to produce all of the plastics they say they're going to do. I don't know these technologies. But regarding your other question about what's happening in Paris next week, so many of you may know this, maybe some of you don't, but UNEP has booked the meeting to be at the UNESCO site, which has space for 1,500 participants, but they have accredited closer to 3,000 people. And they had sent an email around last week saying they will only give one floating pass per observer organization that is registered, which means that they could be essentially locking out up to 80% of participants from the different observer groups. And this is highly problematic. We don't really know who is going to be in the room. I would really like to see for UNEP or the INC to make the participation list very transparent, to tell us who's in the room, who's at the table. Obviously, the national delegations will be there, but who else is going to be there? This is very important information.
So my final question was going to be, there's lots of calls for like data and scientific evidence to support this process, but what are actually the opportunities for providing sort of that data and for the science community to contribute to the treaty process? And
yes. So this treaty process right now does not have an official mechanism for science advisory, which is different than what has been done in the past. So this group that I am a member of, the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, is sort of formed through the interest of different experts from around the world to contribute to this process, because we do have a lot of knowledge. And the group right now has scientists, 200 scientists from 45 different countries with very diverse backgrounds. And our only goal is to provide the best state-of-the-art knowledge that we have in our hands to the delegations, so they're making decisions based on evidence. How we get that information to them is another question. Some of us were in Uruguay. There's quite a lot of us going to Paris next week. I don't know if we'll be in the building or on the sidewalk outside. That remains to be seen. We're writing briefing documents. We've been hosting webinars also together with the High Ambition Coalition. And we're really just trying to talk to people and tell them what we know, so we can support them in their decision-making.
All right, thank you. So time is unfortunately up. Great whole discussion. I would have loved to continue for another hour or two, but thank you so much for joining us. So it's 4:30. Let me check. Yes. It's 4:30 and it's more than time to wrap up. I think it's been a day of very interesting conversations about the complexity of chemicals and plastics, despite the fact that our brains hate complexity. Sort of pointing to the need to think about this from many different perspectives. Climate change, as was sort of the starting point for us in this project, but it so clearly also connects to other issues of environmental impact, toxicology, human health, and right to livelihood in many parts of the world, etc. So I learned a lot. I hope that you all did too. And for those of you in the room, there are paper copies of the report to everyone online. We will be sending a link to where you can download the report so that you can all read it and digest it after today. So thank you so much for joining.